Ethan Caldwell tore the letter in half, then stopped staring at the two ragged pieces in his fists like they might bite him. 3 years he'd kept the world off his land. 3 years of silence he'd paid for in blood and sweat. And now a stranger was coming to break it. "A woman," he said to the empty kitchen. "They sent me a woman." The dust cloud was already rising on the road out past the gate. Too fast. Coming straight for him, and there wasn't a thing on God's earth he could do to stop it. Before we go on, if stories about broken men and the women who mend them move something in you, subscribe and stay with me to the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story travels. The stagecoach came down the ranch road like it was running from something. Ethan heard it before he saw it. The crack of a whip, the rattle of wheels hitting every rut in the summer-baked earth, the driver hollering at the horses to slow, and the horses not caring. He stepped out onto the porch with the torn letter still crushed in his hand, and he watched the whole thing come apart in front of him. The stage didn't slow. It skidded. The lead horse reared. The driver hauled back on the reins, and the coach lurched sideways in a cloud of dust so thick Ethan lost sight of it for a full second. Then it stopped. And in the quiet after, before the dust had even settled, he heard a sound he had not heard on his ranch in 3 years, a baby crying. He went still. The driver climbed down, mopping his face with a filthy sleeve. "Mr. Caldwell." Ethan didn't answer. He was looking past the man at the coach door, which had swung open, and at the figure stepping down out of it, a woman, thin, her dress the color of dried mud, holding a bundle against her chest that she was trying and failing to keep quiet. "You Caldwell or not?" the driver said again. "I'm Caldwell." "Then this here's your delivery," the driver spat. "And I'll tell you plain, I don't get paid enough to haul a squallin' infant 40 miles in this heat. Woman didn't say nothing about a child till we was too far out to turn back." Ethan came down off the porch, slow. Every step deliberate, the way a man walks toward a fence he already knows is broken. The woman had gotten the baby quiet, or near enough. She held the child high against her shoulder, and she watched Ethan come, and there was something in her face that he recognized before he could name it. He'd seen it in the mirror. He'd worn it 3 years running. She was terrified, and she was pretending she wasn't. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Caldwell." Her voice was steadier than her hands. "My name is Mary Ann Whitmore. I answered your notice, for a cook and a housekeeper." "My notice?" Ethan looked at the torn letter in his fist, then back at her. "My notice said one person, a cook, just the one." "I am one person, sir." The baby made a small sound against her shoulder. Not a cry, just a sound. A living, breathing, unmistakable sound. Ethan let the silence sit there between them until it grew heavy. "That there," he said quietly, "makes 2. Mary Ann's chin came up. "He's no trouble. He's crying. He was frightened. The coach—" "Ma'am." Ethan held up a hand and she stopped. He turned to the driver. "You wait." "I ain't waiting. I got a schedule. You'll wait 10 minutes or you'll explain to the stage line why you left a woman and a child stranded on private land in July." Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The driver looked at him and looked at the sun and swore under his breath and sat back down on the driver's box. Ethan turned back to the woman. "Miss Whitmore." "Mrs.?" "Mrs. Whitmore." He said it carefully. "Where's the child's father?" For the first time, her steadiness cracked just a hair, just at the edges. "Dead. Near a year now." "I'm sorry to hear it." "You don't need to be sorry. I need the work." Ethan looked at her a long moment. Then he looked at the child. The baby had turned its face toward him now, red and damp and screwed up against the light, one tiny fist pressed to its mouth. A boy, he guessed. Something about the size of him, the shape of that scowl. He looked away. "I put out that notice for a reason, ma'am," he said. "I run a working ranch. Cattle horses, 7 hands who eat like they've never seen food. I need somebody who can cook for the lot of them and keep a house that's gone half to ruin and who can do it without me having to stop and mind 'em. What I did not need," He nodded at the bundle. Was a nursery. Then I'll mind him myself. While you're cooking for 9 grown men, I've done harder. I doubt that. Something flashed across her face, not anger quite, closer to insult. Do you? She said. It wasn't a question. Ethan Caldwell was not a cruel man. He'd tell anyone that, and most who knew him would agree. But he had built a wall around himself so high and so tight that a woman and a child arriving on his doorstep felt less like a mercy than a breach. He wanted them gone. He wanted the quiet back. He wanted the world to stay exactly as far away as he'd pushed it. And the wanting was so strong it frightened him a little, because underneath it, way down where he didn't look, something else was stirring, that he'd buried 3 years back, and sworn he'd never dig up again. Get back in the coach, he said. The driver'll take you to town. There's a boarding house. I'll pay the fare and a week's lodging, and I'll wire the agency to send me somebody without... He stopped himself. Without a baby. Marianne finished for him. Without complications. She didn't move. She stood there in the sun with her dead husband's child on her hip, and she looked at him, and Ethan waited for the tears. He was braced for them. He knew how to be unmoved by a woman's tears. God knew he'd had practice enough being unmoved by his own. But she didn't cry. Mr. Caldwell, she said, I have $4 to my name. The boarding house in that town charges $2 a night. Do you understand what you're telling me to do? You're telling me to take my son back to a town where I know not a living soul with money enough for 2 nights and a meal, and after that... Her voice did not break. She would not let it. After that I don't know. And I think you know I don't know. And I think that's easier for you than looking at us. The driver up on his box had gone very still and was pretending to study the horizon. Ethan's jaw worked. That's not... I answered your notice honestly. Cook and housekeeper. I can do both, and do them well, and I never once claimed to come alone because your notice never once asked. If you'd wanted a woman with no ties, no history, no heart still beating for somebody, you should have said so. Most men would have. She shifted the baby higher. But you'll have to say it to my face. You'll have to send us off yourself. I won't climb back into that coach and make it easy for you. For a long moment, nobody said anything at all. A hawk cut across the sky. One of the horses stamped and blew. Somewhere out past the barn, a hand called to another, and got no answer. Ethan Caldwell looked at the woman, and he felt the wall he'd spent 3 years building give one long, low groan, like a beam about to go. What's his name? He said. Marianne blinked. It wasn't the question she'd been braced for. Jacob? Jacob! Ethan said it like he was testing the weight of it. How old? 10 months. 10 months. He rubbed a hand down his face, and when he took the hand away, he looked older and more tired and less certain than he had a minute before. 10 months old, and you dragged him across a territory to work for a man you never met. I dragged him across a territory, Marianne said, because I had nowhere else to drag him. And there it was. Ethan had heard 100 hard-luck stories in his life, and turned most of them away because a working ranch could not run on charity, and a man who'd lost everything learned quick to stop his ears against other people's losing. But there was something about the flat, plain way she said it. No wailing, no wringing of hands, just the naked arithmetic of a woman with a baby, and $4, and nowhere to go, that got past all of it. Got clean past the wall, and into the room behind it he never let anybody into. He thought of another woman, another summer, a different kitchen before it went empty. He shoved the memory down hard. Driver, Ethan said, without looking away from Marianne. Bring her trunk down. The driver blinked. Say again. Her trunk. Bring it down. She's stayin'. Marianne's arms tightened around Jacob. She didn't quite believe it yet. He could see her not believing it. You said complications. I did say that. Ethan reached up and took the small battered trunk the driver was lowering and set it on the ground beside her, and stood there with his hat pushed back and his hands on his hips, like a man trying to figure out what he'd just done. I meant it too. Understand me, ma'am. This is not charity, and it's not soft-heartedness, And don't you go telling the hands it is. You're here to work. You do the work, you earn your keep, and the boys. First week's a trial. You can't manage both the cooking and the child, you're gone. And I won't hear a word about it. Are we clear? We're clear. 7 days. 7 days? She agreed. And the boy stays out from underfoot. He's 10 months old, Mr. Caldwell. He can't walk. There's nothing to get underfoot with. Ethan almost smiled, caught it before it happened. Then we'll get along fine. The driver, glad to be shed of the whole business, tipped his hat, hollered at his horses, and had the coach turned around and rattling back up the road inside a minute. Ethan and Mary Ann stood in the settling dust and watched it go. And for a moment, it was just the two of them, and the baby, and the enormous, unfamiliar fact of what had just been decided. Mr. Caldwell, Mary Ann said. Ethan's fine. Mr. Caldwell, she said again gently, letting him know she'd noticed the offer and wasn't ready to take it. Thank you. Don't thank me. He picked up the trunk. Thank me in a week if you're still here. Kitchen's this way, and I'll warn you now, last woman who cooked in it left 3 years back, and it hasn't been cleaned proper since, and the stove's got a temper worse than mine. I'll manage the stove. Everybody says that. He led her toward the house, and she followed, and the baby made his small living sounds against her shoulder the whole way. Ethan didn't look at the child again. He was careful about that. But he heard it every gurgle, every catch of breath, every soft complaint, and each one landed somewhere in him that he'd thought was closed for good. Inside the kitchen was worse than he'd let on. Mary Ann stood in the doorway and took it in the cold ash heaped in the stove, the dust thick on every surface, the crates and clutter shoved into corners by men who'd been fending for themselves and doing it badly. And Ethan waited for her face to fall. It didn't. Well, she said, there's water, and there's a stove, and there's 4 walls. I've started with less. Have you now? I have. She looked around for somewhere to set the baby, found nothing, and after a beat unwound the shawl from around her shoulder and made a kind of nest of it in the seat of the one clean chair and settled Jacob into it. The baby fussed, then didn't. She rolled up her sleeves. I'll need supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, whatever meat you've got. And a scrub brush if such a thing exists in this house. There's flour in this pantry. Coffee too. Meat's in the smokehouse. My hand Belle'll show you. Scrub brush. Ethan glanced around. Can't rightly say. Then I'll make one. He studied her. You're not what the agency usually sends. What does the agency usually send? Women who last a week, sometimes less. They come out expecting a homestead with a garden and a rocking chair, and they find 9 men and a lot of manure, and no town within 40 miles, and they cry, and they leave. He said it flatly. You cry. Mary Ann looked at him. She had a smudge of dust already on her cheek, and her hair was coming loose from the coach ride, and she'd been on the road since before dawn, and she looked him dead in the eye and said, Not where anyone can see Mr. Caldwell. Now are you going to stand in my kitchen all afternoon? Or are you going to send me that man Belle so I can find your smokehouse? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. I'll send Belle, he said, and left. He got as far as the porch before he had to stop. He stood there in the summer heat with his hand braced against the post, and he made himself breathe slow, because his chest had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. He'd meant to say no. He'd walked down off that porch fully intending to put the woman and her baby back on the coach and be shed of them by nightfall. He'd had the words ready, and instead he'd carried her trunk into the house and told her to make herself a scrub brush. Fool, he said to the yard. The yard didn't argue. Out by the corral Belle, a lean, gray-weathered man who'd been with the ranch longer than Ethan had owned it, straightened up from the fence he was mending and squinted toward the house. That the new cook? He called. That's her. Heard a baby. You did. Belle said nothing for a moment. He was a man who could say nothing louder than most men could shout. Huh, he said finally. Go show her the smokehouse, and Belle. Ethan came off the porch. The men keep a civil tongue around her. All of them. She's here to work same as them. Anybody makes her feel less than that they answer to me. Understood? I'll pass it along. Belle started toward the house, then paused. Ethan? What? The old man looked at him, and there was something almost like hope trying to get past his weathered face, and something like caution holding it back. Been a long time since there was a young'un on this place. It's a week, Belle, trial. Don't go getting notions. Wouldn't dream of it, Belle said, and went, and Ethan stood alone in the yard, knowing full well the old man was already dreaming of exactly that, and half hating him for it, and half God help him hoping he was right. He didn't get 20 feet before Tucker found him. Tucker was the youngest of the hands and the loudest, and he came around the barn wiping his hands on a rag with his hat, shoved back and trouble already sitting on his mouth. Belle says there's a baby. Belle talks too much. Is there or ain't there? Ethan stopped. There is, on a cattle ranch. Tucker laughed short and mean. You gone soft, boss. We got trouble coming over that north water, and you're bringing in a widow and a squalor. Watch your mouth. I'm just saying what the others are thinking, and ain't got the sand to say. A woman I could see. A woman cooks, that's fine. That's better'n fine. We've been eating like hogs for 3 years. But a baby's gonna cry all night and cost all day. And the first time that woman's got to choose between her boy and our supper, we both know which way she jumps. Tucker jerked his chin toward the house. She stays. The boy goes to town. That's the sensible. Ethan closed the distance between them in 3 steps, and Tucker's mouth shut like a trap. You been here 2 years, Ethan said low. You know what happened on this place 3 summers back? Tucker went pale. Everybody knows, boss. I didn't mean, then you know what I buried under that cottonwood. Ethan's voice never rose, and that was the frightening part of it. So you'll understand me clear when I tell you that as long as that baby's on my land, he's under my roof and under my protection, same as any man drawing wages here. You got a quarrel with a 10-month-old child, Tucker, you bring it to me, not to her, not ever to her. You hear me? The young hand swallowed. I hear you. Say it back. The boy's under your protection. I hear you, boss. Good. Ethan stepped back. Now go tell the others what you heard, so I don't have to say it 9 times. Tucker went. Fast. And Belle, who had been standing in the smokehouse door, listening to the whole of it, came out slow with a slab of salt pork under his arm and a look on his face Ethan didn't care for at all. Don't, Ethan warned him. Didn't say a word. You were about to. Belle started toward the house, then paused, and this time he did say it. You called him a child under your protection. Not a complication, not a problem. A child. The old man let that sit. 3 years I watched you not say a word came close to it. It's a figure of speech. Sure it is. Belle tipped his hat and ambled off toward the house with the meat, and Ethan stood there in the yard for the 2nd time that day, feeling like the ground had shifted under him without so much as a warning. Inside, through the open window, he could hear her already. Talking low to the baby as she worked, the scrape of ash being shoveled, the clank of a pot, the small, ordinary music of a kitchen coming back to life after 3 years of silence, and it went through Ethan Caldwell like a blade, because the last time he'd heard those sounds, the woman making them had been his wife, and she had been 8 months carrying their first child, and by the end of that same summer, he'd buried them both in the same grave under the cottonwood past the barn. He hadn't let a woman set foot in that kitchen since. Hadn't been able to. He'd eaten cold biscuits and burnt beans for 3 years rather than hear those sounds again. And now, here they were, in his house. Because he hadn't been able to say the one word he'd walked down there to say. Ethan pulled his hat low and walked out toward the far pasture where the cattle were, where there was work enough to keep a man from thinking. But the sounds followed him, the clank of the pot, the low murmur of her voice, and underneath it all, faint and terrible and impossibly sweet, the small living sound of a child breathing in a house that had held nothing but the dead for 3 long years. He worked until dark. When he came in, there was a lamp lit in the kitchen window, The first lamp lit in that window in 3 years, and the smell of real food on the air, bread and salt pork and coffee, and Ethan stopped at the edge of the yard and stood there in the dark a long while before he could make himself go inside. Marianne had set a plate for him at the head of the long table. The baby was asleep in the shawl nest in the corner. The hands had already eaten, he could tell by the state of the pots, and gone off to the bunkhouse, and by the look on their faces when he passed a couple of them in the yard. They'd eaten better than they had in years. They liked it. Marianne said, not turning from the stove, "You're men. Nobody said so, but I've cooked for enough hard men to know." The one called Belle went back for thirds and pretended he didn't. Ethan sat down heavy at the table. He looked at the plate. He looked at the sleeping child in the corner. He looked at the woman standing at his stove in the lamplight, and for one dizzying second, the years fell away, and it was another woman standing there, and his chest did the tight thing again, worse this time. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "Mr. Caldwell." "That chair you got the boy in." His voice came out rougher than he meant. "My wife made the cushion on it, before she passed." Marianne went still. She turned. She looked at the baby sleeping on the faded blue cushion, and then at Ethan, and understanding moved across her face, slow and careful. "I didn't know." "Course you didn't. No way you could." He picked up his fork, put it down again. I wanted you to know whose chair it was." "Do you want me to move him?" Ethan looked at Jacob a long time. The baby's chest rose and fell. One small hand had come free of the shawl and lay open against the blue cushion his dead wife had stitched by lamplight the last summer of her life. "No," Ethan said finally, and his voice was not quite steady. "No. Leave him be. It's good the cushion's getting some use. She'd have wanted that." He picked up the fork again, and this time he held on to it. "She always did say the house was too quiet." Marianne didn't say anything. She had the good sense not to. She just turned back to the stove and let the man eat in peace. And if she noticed how long it took him to lift that first bite, or how he stopped once halfway through and pressed the back of his wrist hard against his eyes and held it there, she never let on. Outside, the Wyoming dark came down soft and warm over the ranch, and for the first time in 3 years, the house was not silent. There was a lamp in the window, and food on the stove, and a woman moving quiet through the kitchen, and a child breathing in the corner. And Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of his own table, with his supper going cold in front of him, undone by all of it, and unable for the life of him to say whether what he felt was grief, tearing back open, or something he'd forgotten the name of, starting very slowly to heal. He woke before dawn out of habit, and out of habit he reached for the silence, the thick familiar quiet that had been the only company he'd allowed himself for 3 years. And it wasn't there. Somebody was in his kitchen. Ethan lay still a moment listening. The soft clatter of a stove lid. Water poured. A voice low and easy murmuring something to a child who murmured back in the wordless way of babies. He'd forgotten a house could sound like that. He'd worked hard to forget it. And now some woman he'd known for less than a day had gone and put the sound back uninvited before the sun was even up. He dressed in the dark and came out to find Marianne Whitmore already elbow-deep in bread dough. Jacob propped in the blue-cushioned chair, gnawing a heel of crust and a pot of coffee, going that smelled better than any coffee had a right to. "You're up early?" Ethan said. "So are you." She didn't look up from the dough. "Coffee's ready. Cups are where you left them, which is to say nowhere sensible, so I moved them. Shelf by the window." "You moved my cups." "I moved your cups." Now she looked up, and there was the ghost of something in her face that might have been challenge and might have been humor. First thing a body learns in another woman's kitchen, Mr. Caldwell, is that there was never any sense to where she put things. You want them back where they were, I'll put them back. But you'll be reaching across the whole room for a cup of coffee for the rest of your life. And that seems a poor way to live. Ethan got himself a cup from the shelf by the window. It was, he had to admit, exactly where a cup ought to be. He didn't say so. Bell came in stamping his boots, took one look at the bread rising, and the coffee steaming, and the baby chewing contentedly on his crust, and something moved across the old man's weathered face that Ethan chose not to examine. Morning, ma'am. Good morning, Mr. Bell. Just Bell. Then good morning, Bell. She slid a plate across the table to him without being asked, eggs and a thick slice of the salt pork from last night fried crisp. Sit, eat. You've got a long day, and you went to bed hungry last night pretending you weren't. Bell sat. He ate. He did not pretend anything. By the time the rest of the hands filtered in, drawn by the smell, the way cattle come to water, Mary Ann had a system running that looked to Ethan like some kind of quiet miracle. Plates coming off the stove and onto the table in a steady stream. Coffee poured before a man knew he wanted it, and all the while the baby balanced on her hip or sat in his chair, never once left to cry, never once allowed to slow her down. The men ate like they'd been starved, which Ethan reflected they more or less had, and one by one they mumbled their thanks on the way out, awkward as boys tipping their hats to a woman for the first time in years. All of them but Tucker. Tucker came in, last ate fast, and said nothing. He kept his eyes on his plate and his hat on his head, and when he was done, he pushed back from the table hard enough to scrape the chair and made for the door without a word. "You forgot something," Mary Ann said. Tucker stopped. "Ma'am, your thanks." She said it pleasant enough, but there was iron underneath it. "The other men managed it. I don't imagine you're less of a man than they are." The kitchen went quiet. Bell, still nursing his coffee in the corner, went very interested in the bottom of his cup. Ethan by the window set his own cup down slow. Tucker turned around. He was young, and he was proud, and he'd been stewing since yesterday, and it all came out of him in a rush. "I'll thank you when I'm sure you're staying, ma'am. No sense getting used to a thing that's leaving in 6 days." "Tucker," Ethan said. "No." Mary Ann held up a floury hand without looking at Ethan, and to his own surprise he stopped. She set down her spoon, and she came around the table, and she stood in front of the young hand, small and plain and unafraid, with her chin tipped up to meet his eyes. "You're right about one thing. I might be leaving in 6 days. That's up to your boss, and I've made my peace with it. But you listen to me, young man. Whether I'm here 6 days or 6 years, every morning I'm under this roof, you'll get a hot breakfast and a full plate and a fair word, because that's the work I came to do, and I do my work. You don't have to like me. You don't have to trust me. But you'll not sit at my table and eat my food and treat me like something the coach dropped off by mistake. Now, is there anything wrong with the eggs?" Tucker blinked. No. The eggs is fine." "Are they good?" A long pause. "They're the best I had in 3 years, Tucker admitted, and the words seemed to cost him something. "Then that's your thanks, and I'll take it." She went back to her stove. "Go on, the cattle won't move themselves." Tucker went. But at the door he paused, and he took his hat off. Actually took it off, held it against his chest a second, and he ducked his head at her. And then he was gone. Bell let out a low whistle into his coffee cup. Ethan said nothing at all, because he didn't trust his voice, because he'd just watched a woman do in one morning what he hadn't managed to do in 3 years, which was make that kitchen a place where a man might want to sit down. "You handle my men better than I do," he said finally. "They're not hard to handle." Mary Ann went back to shaping her loaves. "They're just hungry and tired, and nobody's looked after them in a good long while. Men aren't complicated, Mr. Caldwell. Feed them, respect them, don't lie to them. The rest sorts itself." "That your husband's wisdom." The words were out before he thought better of them, and he saw them land. Her hands went still on the dough for just a moment, just one, and then kept moving. "No," she said quietly. "My husband taught me the other kind of lesson, the kind you learn by its absence." And she said nothing more, and Ethan, who knew better than most that some doors ought not be knocked on, let it lie. The first day passed, then the second. The ranch changed under her hands, the way a fever breaks so gradual you don't notice, and then all at once, you realize the worst is over. The house that had gone gray and stale, with 3 years of a widower's neglect, began room by room to come back. She scrubbed the kitchen down to bare wood, and it smelled of soap instead of old ash. She beat the dust out of curtains Ethan had forgotten were even there. She found his dead wife's garden gone entirely to weeds, and she said nothing about it, only cleared one corner and put in what late seed she could beg off the general store, and within a week there were green things pushing up where there'd been nothing but thistle. And the men. The men were the biggest change of all. They stood straighter. They laughed more. They fought less. A ranch runs on the bellies of its hands, and for 3 years these particular bellies had run on burnt beans and Ethan's black moods, and now they ran on hot bread and fair words, and the small daily grace of a woman who remembered which of them took sugar in his coffee, and which of them had a bad knee that ached before rain. Ethan watched all of it from a careful distance. He told himself he was watching to judge her work. That was the arrangement. 7 days a trial, and he'd be a fool not to keep an eye on his investment. But the truth which he did not tell himself was that he watched her because he could not stop. And he could not stop because every time he looked at that woman moving through his dead wife's kitchen with a baby on her hip, some part of him he'd nailed shut 3 years ago, rattled at the boards. It was on the 3rd day that he noticed she wasn't eating. He noticed it the way he noticed a lame horse, not all at once, but as a wrongness that nagged at him until he looked straight at it. 9 men and herself, and she cooked for all of them. And by the time every plate was full and every cup poured, there was precious little left in the pots. And what little there was, she scraped together and mashed and fed to the boy, and for herself, she took bread. Just bread. A heel of it standing at the stove while 9 men ate her cooking at the table. "You didn't eat," Ethan said on the 3rd night when the hands had gone and it was just the 2 of them and the sleeping boy. "I ate." "You ate bread." "I like bread." "Mrs. Whitmore." He set his cup down. "There's a difference between a woman who likes bread and a woman who's making sure a growing boy gets fed first and there's nothing left over for her. I know the difference. I've watched you 3 days running." Her back was to him at the stove, and he saw her shoulders go stiff. "The arrangement was, I feed your men. Nobody said anything about feeding me. I earn my keep and the boys. That's fair. I won't take more than I earn. You're working from dark to dark on a heel of bread. I've done more on less." She turned, and her chin was up in that way it had. "When Jacob's father died, there were weeks I gave the child what milk I could buy, and lived on what a body can live on, which is more than you'd think and less than you'd want. I'm not fragile, Mr. Caldwell. Don't make me out to be. A woman who lets herself get fed first is a woman who's forgotten there's someone smaller depending on her, and I'll not forget it. Not ever again." Ethan looked at her a long moment. Then he got up, and he went to the pantry, and he came back with a slab of the salt pork and a fistful of eggs, and set them on the counter beside her, hard enough to make the point. "New arrangement," he said. "You cook for 10. You're the 10th. You sit at that table with the rest of us, and you eat a full plate every night, and if I catch you standing at that stove eating bread while my men eat your cooking one more time, I'll take it as you breaking our deal, and you know what I said about breaking the deal. You'd send me off for eating too little." There was almost a laugh in it. "I'd send you off for lying to me about it." But there was no anger in his voice, and they both heard that too. "That boy needs his mother strong, and these men—" He stopped and started again gruffer. "These men do better with you than without you. I do better. There, I said it. Now eat, woman, and quit arguing. I've got a headache and it's got your name on it." Mary Ann looked at the pork and the eggs on the counter, and then at the hard man scowling at her like feeding her was a chore he resented, and she understood exactly how much it wasn't, and she had to turn back to the stove quick so he wouldn't see her face. "Fine," she said to the wall. 10. 10. Ethan agreed and went to bed, feeling for reasons he declined to examine better than he had in 3 years. He kept his distance from the boy most of all. That took work. Jacob Whitmore had decided in the way of babies that Ethan Caldwell was the most fascinating object on the ranch. Every time Ethan came near, the boy's whole face lit up, and his fat arms went out, and he made the eager, demanding sounds of a child who wants to be picked up. And every time Ethan found some reason to be elsewhere, a fence to check, a horse to see to, anything. "He likes you," Mary Ann observed on the 4th evening, watching Ethan all but flee the kitchen when Jacob reached for him. "He likes everybody. He's a baby. He doesn't reach for Tucker." Tucker's got a mean face. Tucker's got a kind face under a scared one, and the baby knows it, same as he knows about you. She was feeding Jacob his supper, a spoon of mashed something the boy was more interested in wearing than eating. You could hold him, you know. He won't break. I've got work. It's near dark. Ranch work don't keep a clock. And Ethan took his hat and went out into the warm summer night and stood by the corral fence, longer than any fence needed standing by, because he did not trust himself to hold that child. Because he knew the way a man knows the weather in his bad shoulder, that if he ever once picked up Jacob Whitmore, he would not be able to set him down again. And then he would be lost. And he had spent 3 years making sure he never had that much to lose again. That was the 4th night. On the 5th night the fever came. Ethan woke to the sound of it, not crying, not the healthy full-lunged squall of a baby who wants feeding, but a thin hitching wrong sound that brought him up out of sleep and onto his feet before he decided to move. He came out into the front room, and there was lamplight under the door of the little side room he'd cleared for Mary Ann and the boy, and through it he could hear her voice, low and steady and frightened, in a way she'd never once let him see. There now, my love. Mama's here. Mama's here." He knocked. "Mrs. Whitmore." The door opened. She had Jacob against her shoulder, and the boy was flushed, dark red and limp, in a way that no baby ought to be limp. His breath coming in those small wrong hitches, and Mary Ann's face when she looked up at Ethan was stripped of every bit of the iron she wore all day. "He's burning," she said. "He was fine at supper. He was fine. And now he's Mr. Caldwell. He's burning up, and I don't—" She stopped herself, made herself steady. "I need cool water, and I need to know how far the nearest doctor is." "Doctor's 40 miles. In town." The number landed on her like a blow. 40 miles in the dark with a fevered infant on roads that were bad enough by day. "Then cool water," she said. "Please, you get his clothes off him, get him cooled down." Ethan was already moving. "I'll wake Belle. Belle doctored more sick calves than any vet in the territory, and a baby's not so different when it comes to fever." It was maybe true, and maybe not, but he saw it steady her, so he said it, and he went out into the yard hollering for Belle in a voice that had the whole bunkhouse up in a minute. What followed was the longest night Ethan Caldwell had spent in 3 years, and he'd spent some long ones. Belle came, gray hair standing on end, and took one look at the boy and started giving orders in the calm, flat voice of a man who'd pulled things back from the edge before. Cool cloths changed the moment they went warm. A tea he had Mary Ann brew from something out of his own kit willow bark, and God knew what spooned drop by patient drop between the baby's lips. Mary Ann held her son and Belle tended him, and Ethan stood in the doorway useless and could not make himself come in. He knew this room. He knew this fear. He had stood in a room very like this one 3 summers gone, while a woman he loved burned with a fever no cool cloth could touch, and a doctor 40 miles too far away. And he had held her hand and told her she'd be fine. She'd be just fine right up until she wasn't. And the child inside her had gone with her, and the silence that came after had swallowed the next 3 years of his life whole. He could not go into that room. And then Jacob, in the middle of a bad spell, opened his fever-bright eyes and found Ethan in the doorway and reached for him. Even sick. Even burning. The boy saw the man he liked best in the doorway and put out one small trembling hand toward him and made a sound that was half cry and half plea, and something in Ethan Caldwell that had been nailed shut for 3 years tore clean off its hinges. He crossed the room. He didn't decide to. His feet just carried him, and then he was on his knees by the bed, and Mary Ann was easing the boy into his arms, almost before he'd thought to hold them out. And then there was a fevered 10-month-old child, pressed hot and trembling against Ethan Caldwell's chest. One damp fist knotted in his shirt, and Ethan was holding him the way he'd once dreamed of holding a child that never got the chance to be born. "There," he heard himself say. Rough. Broken. "There now, little man. I got you. I got you. You just breathe. You just keep breathing, and I'll do the worrying for the both of us." Jacob quieted against him. Not all at once, but the frantic edge went out of him, and his breathing, though still too fast, lost some of that terrible hitch, and he burrowed his hot face into Ethan's chest and gripped his shirt and stopped fighting. Belle and Marianne exchanged a look over the two of them that Ethan didn't see, and neither one said a word. The fever broke near dawn. Ethan didn't move the whole night. He sat on the floor with his back against the bed and the boy against his chest. And every hour, Marianne changed the cloths, and Belle checked the boy's color, and somewhere in the deepest part of the dark, when the fever was at its worst, and Ethan was more frightened than he'd let himself be in years, he found he was talking to the child. Low, just for the two of them. "You don't get to go," he told the sleeping burning boy. "You hear me? I did that once. I sat in a room like this, and I watched somebody go, and I have been no kind of man since. So you don't get to. You fight this. You fight it and you stay, and I swear to you, I swear it, you'll never want for a thing as long as I'm above ground. You'll have this whole ranch. You'll have—" His voice failed him. He pressed his lips to the boy's hot hair and got it back. "You'll have me, for whatever that's worth. You'll have me." He didn't know Marianne was awake. He didn't know she'd heard every word. She lay on the bed above them with her arm hanging down so her fingers could rest against her son's back, feeling him breathe, and she looked at the hard, grieving man who had knelt on her floor all night, murmuring vows to a child that wasn't his. And something happened in her that she was not at all ready for, and could not afford, and could not stop. Toward dawn, the boy's skin cooled, his breathing eased. He slept real sleep, the deep, boneless sleep of a baby, past the worst of it, and Belle felt his forehead, and sat back on his heels, and let out a breath. "He'll do," Belle said. "Fever's broke. He'll be weak and cranky a day or two, and he'll want feedin' up, but he'll do." He got up with a groan, his old knees popping. "Seen it 100 times in calves. They scare you to death, and then they're up butting the fence like nothing happened." "Thank you, Belle," Marianne whispered. "I'll never be able to—" "Don't." Belle waved her off gruff. "Man does what's needed. Go get some sleep, the both of you." He looked down at Ethan still sitting on the floor with the sleeping boy against his chest, plainly unwilling to move. "Or don't," he added quieter, and went out and shut the door soft behind him. The room went still. Marianne leaned down off the bed. "You can put him in the crib now. He's sleeping." "I know. You don't have to hold him all night." "I know that too." But he didn't move. And after a moment, Marianne understood the way she understood most things about this man, before he understood them himself, that it wasn't the boy he couldn't let go of. It was the letting go. He'd let go once, and it had cost him everything. And now here he was on the floor at dawn, with a warm live child breathing against him, and he could not for the life of him make his arms open. "Mr. Caldwell," she said gently. "Ethan." He looked up. It was the first time she'd used his name, and it landed somewhere it had no business landing. "He's not going anywhere," she said. "He's staying right here. You saved his life tonight, you and Belle. He's staying. But you have to sleep, and so do I, and he sleeps better in his own bed, I promise you. I promise he'll still be here in the morning." Slowly, like a man setting down something he'd carried too long to trust his own hands with it, Ethan rose and eased the sleeping boy into the crib. Jacob stirred, sighed, and settled one fist by his cheek. And Ethan stood over the crib a long moment, looking down at him, and then he straightened. And he was Ethan Caldwell again, closed and hard and careful, except that something in his face had cracked in the night and hadn't quite sealed back over. "That's twice now," he said quietly. "Twice what? Twice you've made me do a thing I swore I'd never do again." He looked at her. "Day you came, I swore I'd send you off. I didn't. Tonight I swore I'd never hold another child. I did." His jaw worked. "You're a dangerous woman, Mrs. Whitmore." "I'm a tired woman, Mr. Caldwell." But she almost smiled when she said it. "Go to bed, please, before the sun's up, and the men want feeding, and neither of us is fit for anything." He went. But at the door he stopped. "The trial," he said without turning around. "The 7 days. Forget it." She went still. "Forget it. You stay as long as you want to stay. Both of you. And he was gone before she could answer, out into the graying dawn, leaving Mary Ann standing alone in a room that smelled of fever and willow tea, watching her son sleep and pressing the back of her hand hard against her mouth so the man wouldn't hear her cry through the thin wall, because she'd told him true the first day. She never cried where anyone could see. The days after the fever were different, and everyone on the ranch felt it, though nobody spoke of it. Ethan stopped fleeing the kitchen. He still didn't say much. He was not a man remade overnight, and the wall came down brick by brick, or not at all. But he stopped finding urgent reasons to be elsewhere when Jacob reached for him. He'd pick the boy up now, awkward as a bear handling an egg, and hold him while Mary Ann worked, and Jacob would grab fistfuls of his shirt and his beard and his nose, and Ethan would submit to all of it with the grave patience of a man doing penance. "You're spoiling him," Mary Ann told him one evening, watching Ethan let the boy gum his knuckle raw. "Somebody ought to. His father never held him, not once." She said it flat, testing something. "Wasn't the sort. Couldn't be bothered." Ethan looked at her over the top of the baby's head. Then his father was a fool. His father, Mary Ann said, was a great many things. And there it was again, that closed door, that shape in her voice of something she carried and would not set down. Ethan had learned by now not to knock, but he was starting to want to. That was new too, and it worried him some. For 3 years, he'd wanted to know nothing about anybody. Now he found himself lying awake wondering what kind of man Jacob's father had been, and how he'd died, and why a young widow with a baby had traveled to the far edge of the territory to work for a stranger rather than stay wherever she'd been. He got his first piece of the answer 4 days later, and he didn't get it from her. There was Tucker too in those days, and Tucker surprised him. The young hand had been quiet since the night of the fever. He'd stood in the bunkhouse doorway that whole long night, Belle said, too proud to come help, and too shamed to sleep. And one evening about a week on, Ethan found him at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and a small carved thing held out awkward in front of him. "Made this," Tucker said to Mary Ann, not quite meeting her eye. "For the boy. It's a horse. Ain't much of one. The legs come out crooked." He set it on the table quick like it might burn him. "Whittled it out of a scrap. Figured a boy ought to have a horse of his own out here, even if he can't ride yet." Mary Ann picked up the little crooked horse and turned it over in her hands, and Jacob reached for it and got it, and immediately tried to eat it. And she laughed, the first real laugh Ethan had heard out of her, and Tucker went red to the ears. "Thank you, Tucker," she said. "It's a fine horse. The best horse. Say thank you, Jacob." She waved the baby's fat fist. "There. He thanks you too. 'Tain't nothin'." Tucker jammed his hat back on and fled, and at the door he passed Ethan, and the boy who'd said a baby had no place on a cattle ranch ducked his head and muttered, "Boss," and was gone into the dark, and Ethan watched him go, and thought that whatever else was coming, whatever man in a clean coat rode up the road, they'd built something on this ranch in 2 weeks that a lawyer's paper was going to have a hard time tearing down. He just didn't know yet how hard they'd all have to fight to keep it. There was the trip to town too in those days, and the trip to town told him something else. They were low on flour and coffee, and a dozen things besides 9 men and a nursing woman went through supplies faster than one bitter widower ever had, and on the 7th morning after the fever, Ethan sent Belle to town with the wagon and a list, and Mary Ann asked careful if she and the boy might ride along. She needed thread, she said, and some things for Jacob that a general store 40 miles off might not stock, but was worth the asking. Ethan said yes before he'd thought about whether he wanted her 40 miles gone for a day, and then spent the whole day finding out he didn't much care for it, which annoyed him considerably. Belle told him the rest that night out by the corral, out of the woman's hearing. "Town wasn't kind to her," the old man said. Ethan turned. "How's that? Folks talk." Belle worked a splinter out of his palm, not looking up. "Word's got around already. Widow come out to the Caldwell place with a baby and no husband. You know how they are in town, church folk. They looked at her like—" He stopped and his jaw tightened. "Like she was something the wind blew in. Wouldn't stand near her at the store. One of the Dunmore women pulled her girl back by the arm when Mrs. Whitmore walked past like the widow'd give the child a fever just by breathing on her. And that Miller woman that runs the dry goods, she made her wait. Served everybody come in, after her first made her stand there with the baby on her hip near an hour, then charged her double on the thread, and dared her to say a word. Ethan's hands had gone still on the fence rail. And what did Mrs. Whitmore say? Not a word. That's the thing of it. She just stood there and took it polite as Sunday paid the double, said thank you kindly, and walked out with her head up like a queen. Bell shook his head. I've buried men with less sand than that woman's got. But I'll tell you what got me, Ethan. It wasn't the store women. It was when we was loadin' the wagon, and a couple of the men outside the saloon got to lookin' at her and sayin' things. Low things. The kind of things men say about a woman alone they figure nobody'll answer for. What'd you do? What do you think I did? I'm 60 years old and I got a bad hip. Bell's eyes came up and they were hard. I walked over and I told him that woman cooks for the Caldwell outfit and she's under Caldwell's protection, and any man's got something to say about her can come out to the ranch and say it to you. Funny thing. He almost smiled. They didn't have near so much to say after that. Turns out your name still means something in that town, even after 3 years of you not showing your face in it. Ethan stood quiet a long moment. She hear all that, the things the men said. She heard it, pretended she didn't, held that baby a little tighter, and kept loading the wagon. Bell tossed the splinter away. On the ride home, she didn't say 10 words. Then about halfway out of nowhere, she says to me real quiet, Bell, is Mr. Caldwell going to be sorry he took us in? And I didn't rightly know what to tell her. So I told her the truth. I said, ma'am, I've known that man 12 years, and I ain't seen him look at anything the way he looks at you and that boy since he put his wife in the ground. Whatever, he's gonna be sorry, ain't it? Ethan looked at the old man sharply. You had no call to say that. Maybe not. Bell pushed off the fence unrepentant, headed for the bunkhouse. But it's true, and she needed truth more'n she needed manners today. Night, boss. And he was gone before Ethan could think of a single thing to say back, which was just as well, because there wasn't one. He stood at the fence a long while, after thinking about a town full of people who'd looked at a good woman like dirt because she'd had the misfortune to bury a husband, and about how she'd stood there and taken it with her head up, and about how she'd asked Belle not whether the town would forgive her, not whether she'd find welcome anywhere, but whether she was going to be a burden to the one man who'd shown her a scrap of kindness. That was the question that kept him up. Not what the town thought, what she thought. That she'd carried her own worry all the way home in silence, rather than let it land on him. He'd spent 3 years believing the kindest thing a man could do with his grief was keep it to himself, so it didn't touch anybody else. He was starting to think he'd had it exactly backward. He was starting to think maybe grief kept to yourself just rotted, and grief you let somebody carry a corner of might be the only kind that ever healed. He didn't sleep much that night either. And in the morning, he was short with the men and shorter with himself because a man who'd sworn off caring about anything had somehow in the space of 2 weeks come to care about damn near everything, and he didn't know how to be that man anymore, and he wasn't sure he wanted to go back to being the other one. Then the stranger came, and the question of what kind of man he wanted to be got answered for him fast. He got his real answer that afternoon, and he didn't get it from her. He got it from a stranger on a good horse who rode up the ranch road one afternoon in a clean coat and a clean hat. A man who didn't belong to any 40 miles of country Ethan knew, and who reined up in the yard and looked around at the ranch with the cool, assessing eyes of a man pricing something he means to own. Afternoon, the man called. This the Caldwell place. Ethan came off the porch, and he didn't like the look of the fellow one bit. Didn't like the clean coat in a country where every honest man wore his work. Didn't like the way the eyes moved over the barn and the stock and the house like sums being added up. It is. Who's asking? Name's Prentice. I'm looking for a woman. The man consulted a small leather book with an unhurried official air that set Ethan's teeth on edge. Widow, Whitmore. Mary Ann Whitmore traveling with an infant child. I have information she took work in this area. Every muscle in Ethan's body went quiet and ready the way it did before a fight. And if she did, then I'd need to speak with her, on a legal matter. Prentice smiled, and it was a lawyer's smile, all teeth and no warmth. I represent certain financial interests, to whom the late Mr. Whitmore was, at the time of his death, considerably indebted. And under the law, sir, a man's debts don't die with him. They pass to his estate. The smile widened. And to his widow. Behind Ethan, the screen door creaked. He didn't have to turn to know she was standing there. He could feel it the way the whole ranch seemed to hold its breath. And when he did turn, Mary Ann Whitmore was standing in the doorway with Jacob on her hip, and every drop of color gone out of her face, staring at the man in the clean coat, like she was looking at a ghost she'd crossed a whole territory to escape. "How did you find me?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was despair worn down flat. "Mrs. Whitmore." Prentice touched his hat, mocking polite. "You're not an easy woman to find. But we're a patient outfit, and my employer, Mr. Hale, is a very thorough man." The name landed in the yard like a struck match. Ethan watched Mary Ann's arms tighten around her son. He watched her go from frightened to something harder and more hunted, a woman bracing for a blow she'd known all along was coming. And he understood all at once that whatever she'd been running from hadn't been left behind at all. It had followed her 40 miles to his door, riding a good horse, wearing a clean coat, carrying a little leather book full of numbers that could take everything a person had. "You're on my land," Ethan said low. Prentice glanced at him unbothered. "I'm aware whose land I'm on, Mr. Caldwell, for now." He tucked the little book away. "I've delivered my message. Mr. Hale will want to discuss the matter of the Whitmore debt in full at his convenience. He's a reasonable man. There are always arrangements to be made for a woman in a difficult position." His eyes flicked over Mary Ann, over the baby, over the whole ranch, and the meaning under the words was ugly and plain. "Do give it some thought, ma'am. A widow alone can't fight what she can't pay. Good day to you both." "Hold on," Ethan said. Prentice paused, one rein already gathered. "This debt." Ethan came a step closer, easy hands loose. "You got paper on it, a note signed by the dead man. Something a court'd look at. We have documentation, Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Hale is nothing if not thorough with his documentation." That cold smile again. "Notes, ledgers, a signed acknowledgement of the sum owed. Interest accrued, compounded quarterly, all of it recorded proper and legal. When we bring it before a judge, and we will if it comes to that, it'll be as clean and airtight a case as ever a man saw. That's how Mr. Hale operates. He doesn't need to lift a hand against anybody. The law does his lifting for him." Prentice looked down at Mary Ann with something almost like pity, which was worse than contempt. "That's what she can't seem to make you people understand. There's no fighting it. There's only settling it. And a woman with nothing to settle it with settles it other ways, or she loses everything. Those are the terms. They've always been the terms. Sounds to me," Ethan said slowly, "like a man who steals with a pen instead of a gun." Prentice's smile flickered just slightly. "I'd be careful, Mr. Caldwell. Slander's a debt, too, and Mr. Hale collects on all of them." He touched his hat once more. "Good day." He turned his horse and rode out unhurried, and nobody in the yard moved until the sound of his hooves had died on the road. Then Mary Ann sat down, right there on the porch step, hard like her legs had quit, with Jacob clutched to her chest, and she looked up at Ethan, with her carefully built world in pieces around her feet. "I'll pack tonight," she said. "We'll be gone by morning. I never meant to bring this to your door, I swear it. I thought 40 miles, I thought that was far enough. I thought—" Her voice broke finally, the iron gone clean out of it. "I'll go. You've been more than fair. But I won't let them take this ranch down along with me. You saved my boy's life. I won't repay you by handing Victor Hale a reason to come after everything you've built." Ethan looked down at her a long moment. Then he lowered himself onto the step beside her, slow. And he did a thing he had not done, could not have imagined doing 1 week before. He reached over and he lifted Jacob out of her shaking arms and settled the boy against his own chest. Easy now, practiced, and the child grabbed his beard and gurgled untroubled having no notion at all that a man in a clean coat had just come to take away his home. "Who's Victor Hale?" Ethan said quietly. "And what's he think you owe him? You don't want any part of this." "I already got a part of it. It rode up my road and stood in my yard and threatened a woman on my land." His voice was very level, and that was the dangerous sound of it, the same flat calm he'd used on Tucker. "So you'll tell me who Victor Hale is, Mrs. Whitmore, and then we'll figure what's to be done, because I'll tell you one thing plain, and you can believe it or not as you please." She looked at him. "You're not packing anything tonight," Ethan said, "and you're not going anywhere in the morning. Nobody takes anything off this land while I'm standing on it. Not my cattle, not my house, and sure as hell not you or that boy." He looked down at Jacob and then back up at her, and something had settled in his face, some old fight coming awake that had been sleeping 3 years. "Now start at the beginning. Who is he?" And Mary Ann Whitmore, who had crossed a territory alone with a baby and $4 rather than ask a soul for help, looked at the hard grieving man holding her son like he'd never let anyone take him. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she stopped running long enough to tell the truth. "You have to understand something first," she said, "so you don't hate me for bringing it here." Her hands twisted in her lap. "That man Prentice, everything he said is true. There's paper. There's a note with my husband's name signed to it and a ledger and figures that all add up clean as Sunday morning. Any judge in the territory would look at it and rule against me in 5 minutes. That's why I ran instead of fought. Because you can't fight paper, not paper that's built right, and Victor Hale builds it right." "Then how do you know it's a lie?" "Because I was there when my husband signed it." Her voice dropped. "And because I know what it cost him, and because 3 weeks after he put his name to that paper, Daniel was dead in a river the law called an accident, and Victor Hale owned everything we had, all nice and legal with the ink barely dry." She looked up at Ethan, and there was no fear left in her face now, only a grief older and colder than his own. "You asked me who Victor Hale is, Mr. Caldwell. I'll tell you exactly who he is." Ethan waited. "Victor Hale," she said, "is the man who killed my husband and made it look like a debt." Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. He just held the boy and looked out at the road where the man in the clean coat had gone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet, Mary Ann had to lean in to catch it. "Tell me the whole of it, from the start." So she did. She told him about Daniel, a good man, a soft man, softer than the country he'd tried to homestead. She told him how they'd come out 3 years back with everything they owned and staked a claim on 160 acres nobody wanted dry and hard, except for one thing: a spring. A good year-round spring, the only reliable water for miles, and Daniel had been proud of that spring, had said it made their land worth 10 times its size. "And Victor Hale," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Victor Hale owned everything around us. Cattle mostly. Thousands of head, and thousands of head need water, and the creeks run dry come August, and there sat our little spring right in the middle of his range on the one piece of ground he didn't own. Mary Ann's hands had gone still. "He offered to buy us out. Fair price the first time. Daniel said no. It was our home. So Hale offered again less, then less. And when Daniel kept saying no, the offers stopped and other things started." "What things?" "Our fence would come down in the night, and Hale's cattle would trample the garden. Then a rumor went round town that Daniel had cheated a man at cards, which he never did. Daniel didn't gamble. Then the bank that held our little mortgage called it all at once. No warning, and it turned out Victor Hale had bought the note. And then—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "Then a man came out with papers. Just like today. Said Daniel owed money he never borrowed to a freight company Hale owned for supplies that were never delivered. And there was Daniel's signature on it, plain as day. Was it his signature? It was close enough that Daniel couldn't swear in court it wasn't. That's how good Hale is. He doesn't forge a thing you can prove false. He forges a thing you can't prove true." She looked down at her hands. "Daniel went to town to fight it, to find a lawyer, find a witness, find anybody. And he never came home. They found him in the river 3 days later. Sheriff said he'd been drinking and fell from his horse crossing at the ford. Daniel didn't drink, and he'd crossed that ford 100 times. Her voice went flat and terrible. But there was liquor in him when they pulled him out, so the sheriff wrote accident, and Victor Hale foreclosed on our land inside the month, all legal, all clean, and I took my baby and what I could carry, and I ran because I knew that if I stayed I'd end up in a river too, and then who'd have Jacob? The boy, hearing his name, patted Ethan's cheek. Ethan didn't feel it. And the debt he's chasing now, Ethan said, the one Prentice came about, is a lie built on the first lie. He says the sale of our land didn't cover what Daniel owed, that there's a remainder, interest on interest. She laughed, and there was no humor in it. I have nothing left for him to take, Mr. Caldwell. I have a baby and a trunk and $4, which is now $2. There's no money in me for him to squeeze. So you have to ask yourself why a rich man sent a lawyer 40 miles to chase a penniless widow. She looked up at him, and he saw she'd already worked it out. Worked it out on the long ride home from town, maybe, or lying awake nights. He's not chasing me. He never was. He's chasing where I landed. The words dropped into the quiet yard and sat there. Ethan went very still. He's after the water, he said slowly. My North Spring. Prentice looked at your barn and your stock like a man reading a price tag. You saw it. I saw it. Mary Ann's voice was steady now, steadier than his. Victor Hale has been buying up this whole territory one drought at a time, and your North Water is the biggest piece he doesn't own. And you're a man who hasn't set foot in town in 3 years, who fired half his hands, who everybody says has gone strange with grief. An easy man to move against. And then I show up on your doorstep, a woman he already has papers on, and hand him the perfect wedge. He doesn't have to fight you for your land. He just has to ruin me on it, tie your name to mine in every court and every gossip in the county, and pick you both off together. She shook her head. I brought the wolf to your door, Mr. Caldwell. I swear before God, I didn't know he'd follow. But he did. And now he's looking at your spring the way he looked at ours. Ethan stood up. He handed the boy back to her careful, and he walked to the edge of the porch and stood there, with his back to her, and Mary Ann watched him and thought, here it comes. Here's where he tells me to go after all. And she couldn't even blame him for it. My wife's name was Ruth, Ethan said. Mary Ann went still. I don't talk about her. Haven't in 3 years. But I'm going to tell you one thing about her because it matters to what I'm about to do. He turned around. Ruth used to say the measure of a man ain't what he builds. Any fool with a strong back can build. She said the measure of a man is what he'll stand in front of, what he'll put his own body between when the wolf comes. His jaw was set hard. I've spent 3 years standing in front of nothing, guarding an empty house, keeping a spring nobody drinks from. And I told myself that was grief, and maybe some of it was. But you want to know the truth of it, Mrs. Whitmore. Some of it was just cowardice dressed up in black. It's easy to guard nothing. Nothing can't die on you. Ethan, so no. His voice roughened. You're not going anywhere. And I'm not handing that man my spring or my name or one hair off that boy's head. He wants a fight over water and widows and easy pickings. Then he picked the wrong ranch because I'm done guarding nothing. He came off the porch step and stood over her, and for the first time since Ruth died, there was something alive in his face, something with teeth. We're going to fight him. In his own courthouse, on his own paper, and we're going to win. Do you hear me? You can't beat Victor Hale in a courtroom. Nobody can. His paper's too good. Then we'll make better paper. Ethan pulled his hat down. Bell. The old man appeared from the barn like he'd been waiting on the call. Boss? Cut out the 8 best horses in the string. The bay's the gray, that black 3-year-old you've been babying. Bell's face changed. Ethan, that black's the finest horse on this place. He's worth... I know what he's worth. That's why we're selling him. Ethan's voice didn't waver. Sell the lot. Get top dollar. I need cash money, and I need it fast, because I'm going to town tomorrow to hire the meanest lawyer $40 can buy. Mary Ann was on her feet. I won't let you sell your horses for me. You don't get a say in it, they're my horses. But he softened it just barely. And it ain't just for you. It's for the spring and the ranch and every other poor soul Victor Hales put in a river and called an accident. This was coming to my door with or without you, Mrs. Whitmore. You just gave me the sense to see it before it got here. He rode to town at first light. He hadn't been to town in 3 years, and it showed men stopped on the boardwalk to stare. Women whispered behind gloved hands. And Ethan Caldwell rode down the middle of the street, ignoring all of it, straight to the small office at the end of the row with the faded shingle that read, A. Ledbetter, Attorney at Law. Amos Ledbetter was old and stooped and half-blind in one eye, and he had a reputation for two things: winning cases nobody thought he could, and being too stubborn and too poor to be bought. Hale had never been able to buy him. That was the whole reason Ethan wanted him. Caldwell! Ledbetter looked up from his papers unsurprised, as if grieving widowers walked into his office every day of the week. Heard you finally came down off that ranch. Heard why, too. Small town. He set down his pen. You're here about the Whitmore woman and Victor Hale. You heard that already. Son, I heard it before you did. Prentice stopped in yesterday on his way out gloating. He likes to gloat, that one. Told me all about the widow and the debt and the rich ranchers gone soft over a baby. Ledbetter's good eye glinted. He wanted me to know, so I'd know not to bother taking your case, which, I'll be honest, made me want to take it about 10 times as bad. Ethan set a heavy purse on the desk. Coin spilled when it landed. That's for the horses I sold. It's yours if you'll fight him. Ledbetter didn't touch the money. He looked at it a long moment, then pushed it back across the desk with one crooked finger. Put your money away, Caldwell. I'll take the case. You haven't heard my terms. I don't need your terms. I've been waiting 11 years to get Victor Hale in a courtroom on the wrong side of his own paper. The old man leaned forward and something fierce came into his ruined face. You want to know why I never left this two-bit town for a real practice in Cheyenne? Because 11 years ago, Victor Hale did to a family named Osgood exactly what he did to the Whitmores. Manufactured a debt, foreclosed a homestead, and when the father went to fight it, Ledbetter's jaw tightened. House fire, whole family. Called it a lamp knocked over in the night. I was that man's lawyer. I couldn't save him. And I have sat in this office 11 years telling myself that someday Hale would get careless or greedy or reach one time too many, and I'd be here when he did. He tapped the desk. And here you are, so put your money away. I'll take my fee out of Victor Hale's hide, and I'll enjoy every dollar of it. Ethan looked at the old lawyer a long moment. You think we can win? No. Ledbetter said it flat. His paper's too good. It's always too good. That's the trap of the man. Everything he does is legal, or looks it, and the law's a poor tool for catching a man who studied exactly how to break it without breaking it. He held up a finger. But every liar leaves a seam somewhere. Every forged debt's got one real fact. It's built around because a lie's easier to sell with a truth inside it. We find that fact. We find the seam. We pull the whole thing apart. So no, I don't think we can win. But I think we can try like hell. And I think Victor Hale for once in his rotten life is going to have to sweat. He picked up his pen. Now, tell me everything the widow told you. And Caldwell, leave nothing out. The thing that saves her'll be the thing you thought didn't matter, Ethan told him. All of it. The spring, the fence, the freight debt, Daniel dead in the river, the new debt Prentice carried the timeline. Ledbetter wrote it all down, and when Ethan mentioned the freight debt, the first one, the one Daniel had died trying to fight the old man's pen, stopped. Say that again. The freight company. Supplies never delivered. That's what she said. Hale owned the freight outfit and claimed Daniel owed for a shipment that never came. When? What month? I don't... Ethan frowned. Spring, I think. She said it was spring when the papers came and Daniel was dead by early summer. Ledbetter set down his pen very slowly. Get the woman in here. Tomorrow if you can. Because if that freight debt was dated to the spring, then Victor Hale made one mistake he doesn't know about yet. The old man's ruined face split into something that wasn't quite a smile. The spring floods. 3 years running that river's been too high to freight anything across till June. If Hale claims he delivered or was owed for a shipment in spring, he claimed a wagon crossed a river that couldn't be crossed, and I can prove it couldn't. I've got the ferry records. I've got the bridge that washed out. I've got 20 men who'll swear the road was under 4 feet of water. He leaned back. It's thin. It's a thread. But it's a real one, and it's exactly the kind of small, true fact a careful liar overlooks. Get her in here, ends. Ethan rode home faster than he'd ridden in years. He found Mary Ann in the garden of all places on her knees in the dirt, with Jacob playing beside her, and he swung down off the horse and told her everything Ledbetter had said in a rush. The ferry records, the flooded ford, the thread they might pull, and he watched hope come into her face and fight against 3 years of learning better. "It won't be enough," she said. "It's never enough with him. Maybe not. But it's a start, and it's more than you had yesterday." Ethan crouched down in the dirt beside her, heedless of his good trousers. "Ledbetter wants you in his office. Tomorrow. You up to it?" "I'm up to anything that puts a scratch on Victor Hale." She said it fierce, and then her face changed, and she looked down at her dirty hands. "But I have to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." "I don't like most things. Tell me." "I've been sewing." She said it like a confession. "Nights after Jacob's down. Quilts. I brought my needles and thread up from town, that's what the thread was for. I sold 2 already quiet through the Miller's store under a false name so nobody'd know they came from the Caldwell place. And I've 3 more near done." She lifted her chin, braced for his anger. "I know you said you'd handle the lawyer, but I won't sit here empty-handed while you sell your horses to fight my war. I'll pay back every dollar those horses brought if it takes me 10 years of quilts to do it. I don't take charity, Mr. Caldwell. I never have. My mother raised me to earn my way or go without, and I'd rather go without." Ethan looked at her, kneeling in his dead wife's garden, dirt on her hands, having sold her own handwork, under a false name to a store that charged her double so she wouldn't owe him anything, and something in his chest turned over hard. "You sold quilts," he said, "under a fake name, to the woman who cheated you on thread, so you wouldn't feel beholden to me." "Yes. You are," he said, "the most stubborn, prideful, aggravating woman I have ever met in my life." "I know. I wasn't finished." He reached out. He didn't quite know he was going to do it until he did. And he took her dirty hand in his rough one, right there in the garden, and he held it. Mary Ann went very still. "I was going to say, I never met anybody I admired more. In my whole life. Not one soul." His voice had gone rough. "So you keep your quilts. You keep your pride. You earn your way if that's what lets you sleep. But you get one thing straight, Mary Ann Whitmore. What I'm doing, I'm not doing it as charity, and you don't owe me a dollar for it. I'm doing it because for the first time in 3 years, I've got something worth standing in front of. That's not a debt. Don't you dare make it a debt. You understand me." She looked at their 2 hands in the dirt. She looked up at him. And what was in her face was more than gratitude, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was ready to say so. And Jacob chose that exact moment to grab a fistful of soil and shove it in his mouth. And the moment broke, and they both lunged for the baby, laughing, and if their hands didn't quite let go of each other for a second longer than they needed to, well, nobody was there to see it. But the boy wasn't telling. The next weeks were a war, though no gun was ever drawn. Ledbetter came out to the ranch twice to take Mary Ann's account in full, and it was on the second visit that the second thread turned up, and it turned up by accident, the way the old lawyer had said the important things always did. He'd been asking her about Daniel, not the man. What kind of man was he who'd known him, who'd vouch for his character before a jury? And Mary Ann, trying to answer, had said the thing that made Ledbetter's pen stop for the second time. He was a church-going man. More than me, if I'm honest. Daniel gave to the church even when we hadn't but pennies. He said a man who couldn't spare a dollar for the Lord had his priorities backward. She'd smiled sad. The spring the trouble started, that same spring before the papers came, Daniel gave the circuit preacher $40. $40 we didn't have. For a new roof on the meeting house. I was furious with him. $40 with Hale's cattle trampling our garden and the bank breathing down our necks. But Daniel said, her voice caught. He said a man ought to leave something good behind him in case he didn't get to stay long. Like he knew. Like he already knew. Ledbetter had gone very still. $40. To the circuit preacher. What was his name? Reverend Kobe. He rode a circuit 3-4 towns. I don't know where he's got to now. And did the Reverend write it down? Church folk keep books on their giving, most of them. Tithes, offerings, gifts for a roof. Mary Ann had frowned, not seeing it. I suppose. There'd be a ledger, wouldn't there? Why does it matter? $40 for a roof has nothing to do with the debt. But Ethan had seen it a half second before Ledbetter said it, and the understanding went through him cold and electric. It has everything to do with the debt, Ledbetter said softly, because the freight debt Hale forged against Daniel was dated that same spring. And Hale's whole case rests on Daniel being a man drowning in obligations, borrowing wild a poor manager who owed money everywhere. That's the story the paper tells. That's the story that makes the debt believable. The old lawyer's ruined face lit up. But a man giving away $40 he didn't have for a church roof in the very same season Hale claims he was desperate and borrowing, that's not a drowning man. That's a generous fool. And a church ledger written in a preacher's hand, dated and witnessed, is a real record made by an honest man with no stake in this fight. It's the one kind of paper Victor Hale can't touch because he didn't know it existed to forge around it. He tapped the desk hard. Find me Reverend Kobe. Find me that ledger. If it says what I think it says, it doesn't just cast doubt on the debt. It puts an honest, dated independent record right on top of Hale's lie and shows the two can't both be true. He rode a circuit 3 years ago, Mary Ann said. He could be anywhere. He could be dead. Then we'd best start looking, hadn't we? Ledbetter was already writing. I'll send word to every congregation on that circuit. You pray Mrs. Whitmore, if you're the praying kind. Because that ledger is thin, as the fairy records were thin, and thin threads are all a man ever gets against Victor Hale. But I've hanged a man on thinner. He looked up sober. If we find it in time. The hearing's set. We don't get to ask the judge to wait while we go hunting a preacher across half a territory. And so on top of everything else, there was now a clock. A ledger that might not exist in the hands of a preacher who might be dead somewhere in a territory the size of a nightmare and a court date that would not move. Word of the case ran through the county like fire through dry grass, and it split the country clean in two. There were folks who took Ethan's side, quiet folks, mostly folks who'd felt Victor Hale's boot themselves over the years, who'd lost water rights or grazing land, or a good price at market because Hale willed it so. They didn't say much out loud, but small things started happening. A neighbor Ethan hadn't spoken to in 3 years rode up one morning and left a side of beef on the porch. No word, just left it and rode off. The ferryman sent word through Bell that his records were Ledbetter's to use and hang the consequences. An old woman in town started telling anyone who'd listen that she remembered the spring. The river flooded, remembered it plain, because her own son couldn't get his wagon across to fetch the doctor and near lost his wife for it. And there were folks who took Hale's side. Louder folks. Folks who owed him money or feared him or simply wanted to be on the winning end of a thing. The Dunmores. The banker. Half the men who drank at the saloon. They said Caldwell had gone soft over a loose woman, that the widow had trapped a grieving fool, that no decent man sold his best horses over a stranger's debt unless she'd got her hooks in deep. It was ugly, and it was everywhere, and it followed Mary Ann every time she went to town, so that she stopped going and sent her quilts down with Belle instead. Even the ranch was divided. Most of the hands stood with Ethan without a word. Belle and Tucker chief among them. Tucker having gone from doubting the widow to appointing himself her personal guard, glaring down any man who so much as looked sideways at her in town. But there were 2 Hands brothers named Croft, who'd been with the ranch a year, and who came to Ethan one evening with their hats in their hands. "We're quittin', boss," the older Croft said. "Ain't personal. But there's talk you're gonna lose this whole place fightin' Victor Hale, and a man that works for Hale's got steady wages, and a man that works for you might be workin' for nothin' come fall." He wouldn't meet Ethan's eyes. We got families. Hale offer you the jobs? Ethan asked quietly. The younger Croft flushed. He might have sent word around that he's hiring for any man leaves the Caldwell outfit. Course he did. Ethan reached into his pocket and counted out their wages fair and full and pressed the coins into their hands. No hard feelings. A man's got to feed his own. But you tell Victor Hale something for me when you get there. He looked at them steady. You tell him I know what he's doing. Buying my hands out from under me, thinning my herd of help, so I can't work the place. So I'll have to sell so he can pick up my water at a foreclosure price. Same play he ran on the Whitmores. Same play he ran on the Osgoods. You tell him Ethan Caldwell knows the whole play start to finish and he's still going to lose. Can you remember that? The Crofts left, and Ethan stood in the yard watching them go and felt the ranch grow a little smaller and a little weaker around him, and knew that was exactly what Hale wanted, and set his jaw and went back to work with the hands he had left. Then the accidents started. That was how Ethan came to think of them in the days after accidents, the same word the sheriff had put on Daniel Whitmore in the river. First it was the fence on the north line, the fence that kept his cattle back from the spring, found cut in the night. Clean cuts a knife, not a break, and 40 head drifted onto open range, and it took 2 days to gather them. Then it was the well by the bunkhouse gone bad overnight, fouled with something dead. Somebody had dropped down it, so the men had to haul water from the creek in the heat. Then it was Tucker. Tucker rode into town for nails, and came back with a split lip and a black eye, and a story he didn't want to tell, and it took Ethan standing over him to get it out. 3 of 'em, Tucker admitted, finally holding a wet cloth to his mouth. Jumped me behind the livery. Didn't rob me. Didn't even hardly hit me but the once to get the message across. His young face was more furious than hurt. Said to tell the Caldwell outfit that a smart man knows when he's beat. Said accidents happen to folks who back the wrong horse. Said, he stopped. Said what? Said it'd be a shame if that pretty widow's baby took another fever out so far from any doctor. Tucker's hand shook on the cloth. That's when I swung on 'em, boss. 3-1, and I swung on 'em anyway. Couldn't help it. Don't be sore. Ethan wasn't sore. Ethan was standing very still in the way that Belle had learned over 12 years to be afraid of. They threatened the boy, he said. They threatened the boy. Ethan didn't say anything else. He walked out to the barn, and he stood in the cool dark alone for a long while, and when he came out, his face was set in a way Mary Ann had not seen before, and he called the remaining hands together and told them to sleep with their guns and ride in pairs, and that no one went anywhere near the house at night but him. And he took to sitting up on the porch after dark, with a rifle across his knees, watching the road the way a man watches a road when he has finally understood that the wolf is not coming someday. The wolf is already in the yard. That was when Victor Hale himself finally came. But the night before he came, there was a moment Ethan would keep long after all the rest, a small, quiet thing in the middle of all that fear. He was on the porch with the rifle past midnight, when the door opened soft behind him, and Mary Ann came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down in the other chair without a word. And for a while, they just sat the 2 of them, watching the dark road together. You should sleep, he said finally. So should you. Somebody's got to watch. Then somebody can want the company. She wrapped her hands around her cup. I sat up alone plenty of nights after Daniel, watching a door, jumping at every sound. It's a particular kind of tired watching for a thing in the dark that might not come tonight, but will come. She looked over at him. You don't have to do it alone. That's all I came out to say. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you didn't have to take any of this on, and you did, and you shouldn't have to carry it by yourself out here. Ethan looked at the road. He didn't trust his voice for a second. 3 years. He said, I told myself alone was safer. Nobody to lose if you've already lost everybody. Made a kind of sense. He turned the cup in his hands. Then a stagecoach comes tearing up that road with a woman and a baby I never asked for. And inside a month, I'm sitting on my porch with a gun more scared than I've been since Ruth, because now there's something to lose again. He met her eyes in the dark. And the strange thing, the thing I can't make sense of, I wouldn't trade it back. I'd rather be this scared with you here than that safe with you gone. What kind of fool does that make me?" "The same kind it makes me," she said quietly. "I ran 400 miles to keep from needing anybody. And here I am needing you so bad it frightens me worse than Victor Hale does." Neither of them moved. The admission just sat there between them in the dark, too big and too true to touch, and after a moment, Marianne reached over and rested her hand on his forearm, just for a breath, and took it back, and they watched the road together, till the sky went gray, and it was the closest thing to peace either of them had felt in years. He came the way a man comes who's decided the errand boys have failed, and he'll have to see to a thing personally. Came in a fine black buggy, with a fine matched team. No lawyer, no hired men, just himself, driving up the ranch road in the late afternoon like he already owned it. And Ethan, watching him come, understood immediately why the man was so dangerous. Victor Hale did not look like a wolf. He looked like a deacon. Silver hair, kind eyes, a soft, handsome face, dressed plain and fine, and when he climbed down from the buggy, he moved slow and easy, and smiled a warm grandfather's smile. "Mr. Caldwell," he put out a hand. "Victor Hale, I believe it's past time you and I talked man to man without lawyers muddying it up. May I?" He gestured at the porch. "I've come a long way, and I'm not as young as I was." Ethan didn't take the hand, but he didn't turn him away either. "Say your piece. May the lady join us. What I've come to say concerns her most of all." Hale looked past Ethan to the doorway where Marianne had appeared with Jacob on her hip, and his kind eyes settled on the baby, and he smiled wider. "And that must be little Jacob. My, how he's grown. He was barely walking when well." The smile turned sorrowful. "When his poor father passed. Such a tragedy. I think about Daniel often, you know. I truly do." Marianne's voice when it came could have frozen the summer air. "Get away from my son, Mrs. Whitmore." Hale pressed a hand to his heart, wounded. "I know you blame me. Grief needs somewhere to land, and I'm a convenient target, the rich man, the creditor. I understand it. I've made my peace with being hated by the people I try hardest to help." He shook his silver head sadly. "But I didn't come here to fight. I came here to end this before it costs you both more than you can bear. So please, let an old man sit down and hear me out, and then I'll go, and you can decide." And against every instinct screaming in him, Ethan gestured at the porch chairs, because Ledbetter had told him one thing above all else: let Hale talk. A careful man gets careless when he thinks he's winning. Let him talk and listen for the seam. Hale sat. He folded his soft hands, and he laid it out gentle as a sermon. "The debt is real, and it's valid, and any judge in the territory will uphold it. We both know this, so I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. Mrs. Whitmore owes my company a sum she can never hope to pay. Now I could pursue it. I could take her to court, win, and be within my rights to garnish any wages, any property, anything she or those who shelter her possess." His eyes moved to Ethan, mild as milk. "Which would include Mr. Caldwell, a lien against this ranch for the crime of harboring a debtor in her assets. That's the law. I don't make it. I just live by it." Ethan said nothing. "But I don't want to do that. I take no pleasure in ruining a young mother." Hale leaned forward earnest. "So here's my offer, and I think you'll find it more than fair. I'll forgive the entire Whitmore debt. Every cent. Wipe it clean. Sign the release, no court, no shame, no lien on your good ranch. Mrs. Whitmore walks away owing nothing to anyone, free as a bird with her child, and her good name restored." He spread his hands. "And in exchange I ask only one small thing." "The spring," Ethan said. Hale smiled, pleased, like a teacher whose student has finally understood. "The North water rights, that's all. A worthless little seep of water on the far edge of your land that you don't even use. You run your cattle south. Everyone knows that. Sign me the North water, and I tear up the widow's debt, and everyone goes home happy. You keep your ranch. She keeps her freedom. The boy grows up safe. And an old man gets a bit of water for his thirsty cattle." He sat back. "Where is the harm? Where is the loss? It's the kindest deal I've ever offered a living soul, and I offer it out of respect for your grief, Mr. Caldwell, which I share, having buried a wife myself. We're not so different, you and I. Two men who've known loss trying to hold on to what's ours in a hard country." The porch went silent, and Ethan Caldwell understood in that silence the full and terrible cleverness of Victor Hale, because it was a good deal. It was on its face a wonderful deal. Sign away a strip of water he genuinely didn't use, and Mary Ann's nightmare ended forever, the debt gone, the shame gone, the boy safe. Any sane man would take it. Any man who cared about the woman would take it. Refusing it meant dragging her through a court she'd likely lose, risking his own ranch, all to keep a spring he'd never once drawn a bucket from. That was the trap. Hale had built it perfect. Take the deal and hand Hale the water that let him choke out every other homesteader in the county for the next 20 years, become the seam in Hale's next forged debt. The story of how even righteous Ethan Caldwell had signed the North Water over willingly. So who could argue when the next family was squeezed, or refuse the deal and be the man who chose a dry spring over a widow's freedom? "Mary Ann," Ethan said, not taking his eyes off Hale. "What do you say?" He was asking her. In front of Hale, in front of everyone, he was handing her the choice, her freedom against a stranger's water, and Hale's kind eyes flicked to her. Certain of the answer, certain no mother would choose a principle over her child's safety. Mary Ann stepped forward. She settled Jacob more firmly on her hip, and she looked Victor Hale dead in his soft, smiling face. "My husband died over that spring," she said. "Not mine, his own. He died because he wouldn't sign away water to you, and you called it a debt, and then you called it an accident. And now you're standing on this porch offering me my life back if I'll finish the job Daniel died refusing to do." Her voice never rose, and it was more frightening for it. "You want me to hand you the very thing my husband gave his life to keep out of your hands. And you dressed it up so pretty that I'm supposed to thank you for it. Mrs. Whitmore, I only mean—" "No," she cut him off. "You'll take nothing, not the spring, not the ranch, not one more inch of this country. My husband was worth more than all your paper, and I would rather stand in your courthouse and lose everything I have, which is a baby and a trunk and $2, than win it back by becoming the thing that killed him." She turned to Ethan, and her eyes were wet and blazing. "Don't you sign him a thing. Not to save me. Do you hear me? I did not run 400 miles and bury my pride in another woman's kitchen to buy my freedom with the same coin that killed Daniel. We fight him, in court. Even if we lose." The silence after that was total. Victor Hale looked at her a long moment, and something moved behind the kind eyes. Something cold and patient, and entirely without warmth. The true face under the deacon's mask there and gone in an instant. Then he stood slow and brushed off his fine trousers and put his hat back on. "Well," he said softly, "I did try. Everyone will know I tried. I offered charity, and it was thrown in my face, and when the court strips this woman bare and puts a lien on your ranch, Mr. Caldwell, folks will remember I offered you both a way out, and you were too proud to take it." The warmth was entirely gone from his voice now. "You've made a poor choice, both of you. I'd hoped you were smarter." He climbed into his buggy and gathered the reins, and then he paused and looked back, and for the first time let them see the thing underneath. "That spring will be mine before the first frost," Victor Hale said. "One way or another. It always is. Ask the Osgoods." "Oh." His mouth curved. "You can't. Good day." And he drove off unhurried, leaving the words hanging in the summer air like smoke. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Mary Ann's legs went, and Ethan caught her baby and all, and held them both up on the porch of the ranch that Victor Hale had just promised to take. And neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that a man like that didn't make a threat. He didn't mean, and the hearing was still 11 days off, and 11 days was a long time in a country where accidents happened to men who crossed Victor Hale. "Ledbetter's thread had better hold," Ethan said quietly. "And if it doesn't—" He didn't answer that. He couldn't. He just tightened his arms around the woman and the boy, and looked out at the empty road, and for the first time truly understood that he wasn't only fighting for a spring anymore. He was fighting for the two people he'd sworn on his knees in the dark he'd never let anyone take. And Victor Hale had just told him to his face that he intended to take them anyway. 11 days, and the thread of a lawyer's hunch between them, and everything Ethan Caldwell had left to lose. The 11 days went by like water through a man's fingers, and every one of them cost something. Ledbetter sent his letters out on the first day one to every congregation on the old circuit, 4 towns, asking after a Reverend Kobe who'd ridden the country 3 years back, and might have a church ledger with a $40 gift for a meeting house roof written in it. Then there was nothing to do but wait, and waiting was the hardest work Ethan Caldwell had ever done. He was a man built for things he could put his hands on: a rope, a fence, a rifle. He could not put his hands on a preacher who might be dead, and it near drove him out of his skin. The answers came back slow, and they came back bad. The first town wrote that Reverend Kobe had left them 2 years past, and gone north, they didn't know where. The second town wrote that they'd heard he'd taken sick. The third town didn't write at all. And on the 8th day with the hearing, 3 days off, a letter came from the 4th town that Ethan read standing in Ledbetter's office, and the old lawyer watched his face fall as he read it. "He's dead," Ethan said. Ledbetter took the letter and read it himself, his good eye traveling the lines. "It says he took a fever last winter and they thought he'd die. It does not say he did." He set it down. "It says he retired, gave up the circuit, went to live with his daughter." He looked up. "It doesn't say where the daughter is. So we've got a dead end and a dead preacher and 3 days. We've got a retired preacher alive as far as anybody's written, and a daughter somewhere and 3 days. Ledbetter's jaw set. "I've won on worse. You go home and you keep that woman and that baby breathing, because Hale's got 3 days too, and a man like that does his ugliest work right before a thing he can't control. I'll find the daughter." Ethan went home, and Hale, as Ledbetter had promised, did his ugliest work. Those waiting days were their own kind of torture, and they did a thing to Ethan and Mary Ann that fear does to people. It pushed them together, and it wore them raw both at once. They took to talking late after Jacob was down, the two of them at the kitchen table with a single lamp between them, and it was in those talks that the last of the walls between them came down, not because either of them tore them down, but because there wasn't strength left to hold them up. "If we lose," Mary Ann said one night, turning her cup and not looking at him, "I want you to promise me something." "I don't make promises about losing." "Promise me anyway." She looked up. "If we lose and they put a lien on this ranch and it comes down to your land or my freedom, you let me go. You let them take me and the debt and be done. You don't lose 4 generations of Caldwell water over a woman you've known 2 months. Promise me." "No." "Ethan." I said no. He set his cup down hard enough to slop coffee on the table. "You want to know why?" "Because you asked me the wrong question the first day you came. You asked would I be sorry I took you in. Belle told me. And the answer's been the same every day since, only I was too much a coward to say it out loud." He leaned across the table. "There is no version of this where I let you go to save a spring. There's no ranch worth keeping, if keeping it means handing you back to that man. I spent 3 years learning that a house you save by keeping everybody out ain't worth living in. I'm not doing it again. So don't ask me to choose between my land and you, because there's no choosing in it. You are the thing worth keeping. The land's just dirt. Do you hear me?" Mary Ann didn't answer. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, over the spilled coffee and all. And they sat like that a long while, and neither of them said the word that was sitting right there in the lamplight between them, because saying it before the trial felt like tempting God. But they both knew it was there, and they both knew the other knew. It came on the 9th night. Ethan was on the porch with the rifle near 2 in the morning, fighting sleep, when the black 3-year-old he'd sold, the one he'd know anywhere, sold to a man in town who boarded at the livery, came up the road at a dead run, with a rider low on its neck, and behind that rider 2 more, and Ethan was off the porch and hollering before the first of them hit the yard. "Belle Tucker, up, up." What followed was fast and ugly, and over in 3 minutes. The 3 riders hadn't counted on a ranch that slept with its guns. They'd come to burn the barn. One of them had a torch already lit, and he flung it, and it caught the dry hay by the door. But Tucker put a rifle ball through the man's shoulder before the torch left his hand, and Bell came out of the bunkhouse firing, and the raiders broke and ran, dragging their wounded man with them back into the dark they'd come out of. The barn fire got beat out with wet blankets and a lot of cursing before it took hold. Nobody on the ranch was killed. But it had been close enough that when the sun came up and Ethan walked the scorched barn wall, his hands shook, and he had to stand a minute before Mary Ann saw them. She saw them anyway. "They came to burn us out," she said. She had Jacob clutched to her, both of them still in their night things. Same as the Osgoods, a fire in the night. They didn't, but they came. Her voice was very small, and then it wasn't small at all. It was hard as flint. "Ethan, 3 days. If we lose in that courtroom, this doesn't stop." He said it himself. The spring, one way or another. Winning the case is the only thing that ends it, because a man who's been beaten in the open in front of the whole county can't afford accidents anymore. Everyone would know. She looked up at him. "We have to win. Not for the money. Not even for the spring. We have to win so we can't ever come up this road in the dark again. Do you understand?" Ethan looked at the black scorch on his barn wall, at the woman, at the boy. "I understand," he said. "Now go inside and stay away from the windows. 3 more days. 3 more days, and we end it one way or the other." But Tucker came to him an hour later while Ethan was still walking the burned wall, and Tucker had something in his hand. "Found this by the barn," the young hand said, "where the one you shot dropped his torch." It was a glove, fine leather, the kind no cowhand wore, and stitched inside the cuff in neat thread were 2 initials. "That ain't a drifter's glove, boss. That's a town glove, a money glove." Ethan turned it over. "You know these initials?" "No." "But Bell might. And a judge might if it come to it." Tucker's young face was grim beyond his years. "They got careless, boss. Sent a man in good gloves to do a low job. That's what happens when a fella's used to nobody ever fighting back." He handed it over. "You hang on to that. Might be it's worth more than the barn it near burned." Ethan hung on to it. He didn't know yet how much it would be worth. That would come later, when the marshals started pulling Hale's world apart, thread by thread. But he knew a careless man leaves careless things behind, and Victor Hale, for all his clean paper, had just gotten careless. The morning of the hearing came hot and bright, and the whole county came with it. They packed the little courthouse in town to the walls, and then some folks standing in the aisles, folks crowded at the windows outside, folks who'd taken Hale's side, and folks who'd taken Caldwell's, all of them come to see whether the rich man would break the widow, or whether for once the widow would break the rich man. Ethan drove Mary Ann and Jacob in the wagon with Bell riding guard beside them and Tucker riding behind. And when they climbed down in front of the courthouse, the crowd went quiet, then loud, then quiet again, and Mary Ann walked through the middle of it with her chin up and the baby on her hip, and did not look left or right, and Ethan walked beside her close enough that his shoulder near touched hers, and dared any man in that crowd with his eyes to say a word. Nobody did. Ledbetter met them on the courthouse steps and pulled them aside before they went in, his good eye sharp. "Listen to me, both of you, because I'll only get to say it the once. I found the Reverend's daughter this morning, wired back she's bringing the old man, if he's fit to travel. But he's sick, and they're 40 miles out, and I don't know if he'll make it before Prewitt gavels this thing closed. So we go in with what we've got, and we pray the rest walks through that door in time." He looked at Mary Ann. "Fairfax is going to put you on the stand, and he's going to be gentle, and he's going to be cruel both at once, and he's going to make you look like a liar. You let him. You don't fight it, you don't cry, you answer plain and short, and you trust me to fix it after. Can you do that?" "I can do anything for one afternoon," Mary Ann said. "Good woman." He turned to Ethan. "And you. You keep your temper in a box, and you sit on the lid. Hale wants you to lose it. A ranchman who blows up in a courtroom is a ranchman gone strange with grief, just like they've been saying. Don't give it to him." Ledbetter almost smiled. "Save it for when it counts." They'd barely started up the steps when a knot of Hale's people blocked the way. The banker, one of the Dunmore men, a couple of saloon toughs, And the Dunmore man said something low and filthy about Mary Ann meant to be heard, and Ethan started to turn temper coming up hot, and it was Mary Ann's hand on his arm that stopped him. "Save it," she murmured, echoing the lawyer, "for when it counts." And she walked straight through the middle of them, with the baby on her hip and her chin up, and they had to step back or be walked into. And the small victory of it, a widow making Hale's men give ground on the courthouse steps, was not lost on the crowd who saw it and murmured. Inside the judge was a heavy sour man named Pruitt, who'd been on the territorial bench 11 years, and Ledbetter had told Ethan the truth about him already. Pruitt wasn't bought exactly, but he wasn't brave, and he'd ruled Hale's way more times than not, because Hale's paper was always clean, and ruling against a man like Hale cost a judge things a careful judge didn't like to lose. "He'll follow the evidence," Ledbetter had said, "but only if the evidence gives him no other place to stand. We don't just have to win. We have to win so plain that even a coward can't rule against it." Victor Hale sat at the front in a fine gray suit with his silver hair combed and his kind face on, and beside him sat not Prentice, but a smooth young attorney down from Cheyenne named Fairfax, all polished boots and easy confidence, and the sight of that expensive lawyer beside old half-blind Ledbetter in his frayed coat told the whole crowd everything they thought they needed to know about how the day would go. It started bad, and it got worse. Fairfax laid out Hale's case like a man dealing a winning hand, slow and sure. The freight note dated 3 springs back, Daniel Whitmore's signature at the bottom. The ledgers of the freight company showing the debt, the interest, the compounding. A handwriting man Fairfax had brought clear from Denver, who swore on the book that the signature was Daniel Whitmore's own. And then, worst of all, the accounting. The foreclosure on the Whitmore land, the sale the remainder still owed all of it, laid out in neat columns that added up that could not be argued with a wall of numbers a mile high. "Your Honor," Fairfax said, "this is not a complicated matter, however much sympathy the defendant's situation invites. A man borrowed money. The man signed for it. The man died tragically, and his debt passed to his estate, as all debts do. My client has been more than patient. He waited 3 years. He offered this woman a full release of the debt not 2 weeks past, in exchange for a minor water right, an offer she rejected out of what I can only call misplaced pride. We are here because she would not settle a lawful debt, that is all. The law is not cruel, Your Honor. The law is simply the law." Then they put Mary Ann on the stand, and Fairfax took her apart. He was gentle about it, which made it worse. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry to put you through this. I'll be brief. Your late husband, was he a good manager of money?" "He was a good man." "That isn't what I asked. Was he good with money? Did the two of you ever come close to losing your homestead to the bank?" A pause. "The bank called our note, yes." "Called it because your husband had fallen behind. Called it because Victor Hale bought it and—" "Yes or no, Mrs. Whitmore, were you behind on your mortgage?" Her jaw tightened. "We were behind." "Thank you. Now the freight shipment this debt concerns. Did you personally see it arrive at your homestead?" "There was no shipment. It never." "Did you see it, Mrs. Whitmore? With your own eyes, yes or no?" "No. Because it didn't. So you cannot testify it never came. You can only testify you didn't see it." Fairfax turned to the jury box with a small, sorrowful smile. "And the papers your husband signed, were you present for every one? Did you read every document that passed under his hand in those final months?" "No, a wife doesn't." "No, of course not. So we have a grieving widow behind on her debts who did not see the shipment, did not read the papers, and cannot tell this court with certainty what her husband did or did not owe." He let it sit. "I'm not unkind, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm only establishing that you don't actually know. You believe, but you don't know." Mary Ann's hands were white in her lap, but her voice stayed level. "I know my husband. Did you?" And then Fairfax turned it the way a man turns a knife already in. "Mrs. Whitmore, is it true that since coming to the Caldwell Ranch you have been selling quilts in town?" Mary Ann went still. "Yes." "Under your own name?" A pause. No. Under a false name. Why would an honest woman sell under a false name, Mrs. Whitmore? Because I didn't want the whole town knowing my business. Or because me. Fairfax said smoothly, you are a woman quite comfortable with concealment, who came to a lonely widower's ranch concealing a child, who sells her goods concealing her name. A woman who conceals your honor might also conceal the truth of a debt she simply does not wish to pay. He smiled. No further questions. It landed. Ethan felt it land. All around the room. Felt the crowd's sympathy tip, saw the judge's sour face settle into a look that had already decided. Mary Ann came down off the stand white and shaking, and she'd held her chin up the whole time, but her hands were trembling when she took Jacob back from Belle, and the baby, feeling his mother's fear, started to cry. That was the moment. The courtroom was against her. The judge was against her. The whole polished weight of Victor Hale's machine was grinding down on a widow and her crying child, and it was working, and there wasn't a thing anybody could. Jacob cried harder, and Mary Ann, undone, couldn't quiet him. And a bailiff started forward to make her take the wailing child out of the courtroom, out into the crowd alone. And Ethan Caldwell stood up. He didn't ask the judge's leave. He crossed to Mary Ann, and he took Jacob out of her arms, and he settled the boy against his own chest. Big hands, sure, now practiced, and he turned his back on the whole courtroom. The judge, the lawyer, Victor Hale, the county. And he stood there in the middle of it all, with the baby against his shoulder, and he murmured low into the small hot ear the way he'd done the night of the fever. I got you. I got you, little man. You just breathe. I got you. And Jacob quieted. The bailiff stopped where he was. Nobody in the courtroom said a word. The judge, who had opened his mouth to order the child removed, closed it again. And Ethan Caldwell stood in the middle of Victor Hale's courtroom holding a dead man's son against his chest. And he did not sit down, and he did not hand the boy back, and he did not let go. And every soul in that room understood all at once, and without a word spoken, that this was not a widower gone soft over a stranger. This was a father. Whatever the paper said, whatever the law said, that was a man holding his own. Mary Ann watched him from her chair, and something broke open in her that no lawyer's cruelty had been able to touch. Because she saw it now, saw the whole of it clear, the way he'd carried her trunk in, when he'd meant to send her off, the way he'd knelt on her floor all night, the way he'd sold his horses, and sat up with a rifle, and stood between her and the whole world, without once being asked. The ranch had never been a place she worked. She understood that now, in the middle of a courtroom, with her son quiet against the chest of a man who owed them nothing. The ranch was where, for the first time since Daniel died, she and her boy had been safe. Where they'd been home. And she'd been so busy guarding her pride and paying her way, and refusing to need anyone, that she'd nearly missed the plain fact of it, the fact that was standing in the middle of the room, refusing to hand back her child. She loved him. She'd loved him a while. And she might lose him and the ranch and everything all in the same afternoon in this room to a man in a gray suit. Mr. Ledbetter, Judge Pruitt's voice was heavy. You may call your witnesses, though I'll tell you plain, I've heard little today that troubles the plaintiff's case. Ledbetter rose. He was old and stooped, and his coat was frayed, and beside young Fairfax, he looked like something the county had forgotten to throw out. But when he spoke, his voice filled the room. Your Honor, the plaintiff's case rests on a single note, a freight debt signed by Daniel Whitmore dated the 14th of April 3 years past. Everything else, the interest, the foreclosure, the remainder they're chasing this woman across the territory, for all of it grows from that one note like a tree from a seed. Pull the seed, the tree falls. He turned to Fairfax's handwriting expert, still seated near the front. So let's talk about that date, the 14th of April. I'd call the plaintiff's own document man back if the court please. Just one question for him. The Denver expert took the stand again, wary now. You examined the freight company's ledgers, Ledbetter said. The originals. In your professional opinion, are the entries genuine, the dates, the amounts all recorded proper in the ordinary course of the company's business? Fairfax half rose, sensing a trap he couldn't yet see. But the expert, proud of his work, answered before his lawyer could stop him. They are. Genuine business records kept contemporaneously. That's precisely why the note is reliable. It's corroborated by the company's own books dated the same period. The shipment was dispatched and billed in April. Dispatched and billed in April, across the county to the Whitmore homestead. Yes, you'd stake your professional reputation on that date. The shipment moved in April. I would. The records are clear. Thank you. Ledbetter smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Because I'd like the court to note that the plaintiff's own expert has now sworn under oath that a freight wagon carried goods across this county in the first weeks of April 3 years ago. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd call the ferryman Josiah Meeks. The ferryman was a huge silent man who'd run the crossing on the county's only through road for 20 years, and Ledbetter walked him through it in plain, unhurried questions. Was he working the ferry 3 springs back? He was. What was the condition of the river that April Meeks answered flat and certain the worst flood in 10 years? The river ran a quarter-mile wide at the ford. The ferry was hauled out and chained down for 6 weeks so it wouldn't wash away. Nothing crossed. Not a wagon, not a rider, not a chicken. He had the toll book to prove it. Not one crossing charged from the last week of March to the second week of June, because there were no crossings, because there was no way across. So, Ledbetter said, if a man told this court that a freight wagon crossed this county in April 3 years ago, carrying, let's say, a shipment of goods to the Whitmore homestead on the far side of your ferry, what would you say to that man? I'd say he's a liar, Meeks rumbled, or a fool because there wasn't no crossin' that whole spring and the whole county knows it. My own brother-in-law like to died waitin' on the far bank with a busted leg. April. That flood. He looked at the judge. You can't bill a man for a shipment that couldn't have moved. It's like billin' him for the moon. The room stirred. Fairfax was on his feet. Your Honor, this proves nothing. A billing date is a clerical matter. The date on an invoice need not be the date of physical delivery. Then the debt is for goods that were never delivered. Ledbetter said, cutting clean through him, which is precisely what the Whitmores have said from the first day. Either the shipment moved in April, which the river makes impossible, or it never moved at all, which makes the debt a fiction. The plaintiff's own expert swore to the April date not 5 minutes ago. Mr. Fairfax cannot have it both ways, and neither can Mr. Hale. And there it was, the seam pulled open in front of the whole county. Ethan, holding the baby, saw Victor Hale's kind face go very still. But Prewitt, coward that he was, wasn't ready to leap. Mr. Ledbetter, you've raised a question about one date. That's a discrepancy, not a fraud. A sloppy clerk, a misdated invoice. It's not enough to void a signed note. The signature stands unless you can show me the debt itself never existed. Can you show me that? Or have you just got a wet river and a lot of noise? The whole room held its breath. Because that was the trap of Victor Hale right there in the judge's words. Doubt wasn't enough. You had to prove the thing that couldn't be proved, that a debt was never real, and no man alive had ever managed it against Hale's paper. Ledbetter stood very still, and Ethan, watching the old lawyer's face, saw the thing he'd been dreading all morning, saw Ledbetter reach for the card he'd been counting on, and find it not yet in his hand. The Reverend hadn't come. 40 miles, a sick old man, a judge already reaching for his gavel. Ledbetter's mouth opened, and for the first time all day, the old man didn't have the next thing ready, and the silence stretched, and Fairfax began to smile, and Victor Hale settled back in his chair with the ease of a man who has seen this moment a dozen times, and knows exactly how it ends. Mary Ann's hand found Ethan's under the table and gripped it hard. He gripped back. Neither of them looked at the other. They just held on the way. People hold on when the water's coming up, and there's nothing left to do but hold on. And Ethan pulled the baby a little tighter to his chest and thought, not this, not them. I can't watch this happen to them. Mr. Ledbetter, Prewitt said not unkindly, which was worse than unkind. Have you got anything else? Or shall I rule? Ledbetter drew a breath to answer, and that was when the courthouse doors opened at the back. Every head turned. Down the center aisle, moving slow, came a young woman in a traveling dress, and beside her, leaning heavy on her arm and on a cane, came a frail old man with a preacher's white collar and a face gone thin with sickness, but with eyes still sharp and burning, and in the old man's free hand held against his chest like something precious was a worn leather book. Ledbetter's voice cracked with something that might have been triumph, and might have been prayer. "Your Honor, the defense calls the Reverend Elias Kobe." The room erupted. Prewitt hammered for order. Fairfax was shouting objections. The witness wasn't on any list. This was ambush. This was irregular. And Ledbetter shouted back that the witness had been sought for 11 days, and found this very morning, that his testimony went to the heart of the fraud, and that the court could hear him now, or explain to the whole territory why it wouldn't. And through all of it, the old preacher just stood there, swaying on his cane, waiting until the noise wore itself out, and Prewitt red-faced growled that he'd hear the man, and rule on it after, and God help Ledbetter if it was a waste of the court's time. They helped the Reverend into the witness chair. His daughter stood close by, and when he spoke his voice was thin, and it shook, but it carried because a courtroom full of people had gone dead silent to hear it. "I rode this circuit 14 years, the Reverend said. Married folks, buried them, baptized their young'uns. I knew Daniel Whitmore, knew him well. A good man, a soft man for this country maybe, but there's worse things to be." His eyes found Mary Ann and gentled. "I'm sorry I'm late, child. I've been 3 days on the road, and I'm not well, and I near didn't come. My daughter told me a lawyer's letter was hunting a preacher about a ledger, and I said, what would they want with an old man's account book? And then she read me the name." His face hardened. "Whitmore, and I knew. I have waited 3 years for somebody to ask me the right question about Daniel Whitmore." "Reverend." Ledbetter stepped close, gentle. "Do you keep records of gifts to your churches?" "Every cent. 14 years of ledgers. A man handling the Lord's money keeps clean books, or he answers for it here and higher up." He held out the worn leather book with a trembling hand. "This is the one for that year. I brought it myself. Wouldn't let it out of my sight. Would you turn to the spring of that year and tell the court what's written there for Daniel Whitmore?" The old man opened the book. His daughter helped him find the page, and he read in his thin, shaking voice that carried to every corner of that silent room. April the 2nd. Received of Daniel Whitmore the sum of $40 for the roofing of the meeting house at Cedar Fork. A generous gift from a man of small means and large heart. Witnessed and recorded E. Kobe Pastor. The Reverend looked up. April the 2nd. 12 days before the date on that debt these men are waving around. I remember it plain because I tried to refuse it. I said, "Daniel, son, you can't spare this. You've got a wife and a baby and Hale's cattle in your garden." And he took my hand and he said, "Reverend, if a hard year's coming, I want to have done one good thing before it gets here." $40. A man doesn't do that. A man doesn't give away money he doesn't have for a church roof in the same season he's supposedly drowning in debt and borrowing wild from a freight company. It doesn't fit. It never fit. Daniel Whitmore was a poor man, but he was a careful one, and he did not owe Victor Hale one thin dime. Fairfax was on his feet. "Your Honor, a charitable gift proves nothing about—" "It proves—" Ledbetter thundered, and for a moment the old lawyer wasn't old at all. That on April the 2nd, Daniel Whitmore was a solvent, careful, generous man, giving to his church. On April the 14th, we're told this same man signed a ruinous note for goods that a flooded river made it physically impossible to deliver. 2 records, Your Honor. One kept by an honest preacher with nothing to gain, dated and witnessed. One manufactured by a man who profits from it. They cannot both be true, and I know which one this court should believe. But Ledbetter wasn't done. And here was the thing Ethan hadn't known was coming, the thing not even Mary Ann knew, because the Reverend had carried it 3 years and never been asked. "Reverend Kobe," Ledbetter said quietly, "is there anything else you remember about Daniel Whitmore from those last weeks? Anything he told you?" The old man's face changed. He looked at Mary Ann, and then he looked at Victor Hale, sitting silver-haired and gray-suited at the front, and something came into the Reverend's sick eyes that was very old and very cold. "He came to me," the Reverend said, "the week before he died, frightened, which wasn't like him. He said a man named Hale was going to take his land, and that when the papers didn't scare him off, Hale's man had come to the house and told him plain that accidents happen to stubborn men. Daniel asked me—" The old voice broke and steadied. Daniel asked me to write down and keep that, if he should die sudden by fire or fall or river, it would be no accident. He made me write it. I have it here, in the back of this same book in his own hand, signed and dated and witnessed by me 8 days before they pulled him out of that river the sheriff called a drowning. The courtroom did not so much erupt as go absolutely, utterly silent. The Reverend turned to the back of the ledger with shaking fingers, and he read Daniel Whitmore's own words, written 8 days before his death, naming Victor Hale. Naming the threat, naming the fear, a dead man's voice reaching up out of 3 years and a river to point one trembling finger straight across the courtroom at the smiling deacon who'd killed him. Victor Hale was no longer smiling. "Your Honor," Fairfax started, and his smooth voice had a crack in it now. This is unverified. This is a dying man's hearsay. This is not. It is a dated witnessed statement. Ledbetter said, in the deceased's own hand, made before a minister, kept for 3 years by a man of God who had no notion its hour would ever come. And taken together with the flooded river, the impossible shipment, the honest ledger, and your own expert's sworn testimony. He turned to face the whole room. It shows the court a debt that never existed, forged against a man who was murdered for refusing to sell his water by a man who has done the same thing to this county for 20 years and called it business. Prewitt sat gray-faced on his bench, and Ethan watched the judge understand that the ground had shifted under him, that the whole county was in that room, that a dead preacher had walked in with a murdered man's testimony, that ruling for Hale now would chain Prewitt's own name to it forever. The coward had at last no place to stand. Victor Hale rose to his feet. He did it slow, and when he spoke his voice was still soft, still reasonable, still wearing the last shreds of the deacon's mask. Your Honor, this is a circus, a sick old man, a lost book wild claims about. I am a respected, I have served this county. Sit down, Mr. Hale, Prewitt said heavily. I will not sit down and be slandered by. Sit down. Prewitt's gavel came down like a gunshot, and for the first time in 11 years, the judge looked at Victor Hale the way the rest of the county had never dared to. You'll have your chance to answer, because you're going to need it. Bailiff. Prewitt's jaw worked. Send for the marshal. The territorial marshal, not the sheriff. I want a federal man given what's just been laid before this court. There'll be a criminal inquiry into the death of Daniel Whitmore and into the business practices of Mr. Victor Hale, and I'd advise Mr. Hale to make himself available for it, because a man who runs will look guiltier than one who stays. And Ethan, standing there with the baby, thought of the fine leather glove in his coat pocket with 2 initials stitched inside the cuff, dropped by a man who'd tried to burn his barn 3 nights past, and understood that Prewitt's inquiry was only the beginning. That once the marshal started pulling, there'd be the glove and the men Tucker could name, and the ferryman, and 11 years of families like the Osgoods who'd been too frightened to speak and wouldn't be frightened anymore, all of it coming loose at once, now that the county had finally seen Victor Hale bleed. A man's whole kingdom built on the belief that he could not be touched, coming down the very hour that belief died in a crowded room. The room came apart then, shouting, weeping. The crowd surging folks who'd taken Hale's side that morning, suddenly finding they'd been against him all along. And in the middle of it, Victor Hale stood white and shaking and stripped for the first time in his life of the thing that had always protected him, the county's belief that he was decent. He looked around the room and found not one friendly face, and he understood, and the understanding aged him 20 years in 10 seconds. He looked last of all at Mary Ann. And Mary Ann Whitmore, who had run 400 miles from this man who had buried her husband and her home and her whole first life because of him, stood up in that roaring courtroom and looked Victor Hale full in the face, and she did not gloat, and she did not weep. She just said quiet enough that only the front of the room heard it, but the front of the room heard it plain. Daniel said a man ought to leave something good behind him. You've spent your whole life leaving ruin, and now that's what you'll be remembered for in every county you ever touched. That's your legacy, Mr. Hale. Not the land, not the water, the ruin and the day it finally caught you. Now get away from my son, for the last time. Hale had no answer. There was no answer. The marshal's men would come for him within the hour, and the county that had feared him for 20 years would spend the next 20 telling the story of how a widow and a broken rancher and a dying preacher had brought him down in open court. He gathered what was left of himself, and he walked out through a crowd that parted from him like he carried a sickness. And the doors closed behind him, and it was over. Judge Pruitt hammered the room back to some kind of order. His voice when he ruled was rough. The court finds the alleged debt of Daniel Whitmore to be without foundation, and very likely fraudulent. It is void. Every claim arising from it, the foreclosure interest, the remainder, the liens threatened against the Caldwell Ranch, void. All of it. Mrs. Whitmore owes nothing. Not to Victor Hale, not to his companies, not to any soul in this territory. He looked at her, and some of the sourness had gone out of his heavy face, replaced by something that might have been shame at how long he'd taken to get here. You're free, Mrs. Whitmore. Clear and free. I'm sorry it took the court 3 years and a dying man to say so. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. And Marianne turned in the roar and the crush of it, looking for the only 2 faces in that room that mattered, and found them right beside her where they'd been the whole time. Ethan still holding Jacob against his chest, still not having handed him back, still not letting go. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. She just stepped in against the both of them, the man and her son, and Ethan's free arm came around her and pulled her in, and the 3 of them stood there in the middle of the emptying courtroom, while the county churned around them, holding on to each other like people who had just learned all at once exactly how much they had to lose and exactly how close they'd come to losing it. It's over, Marianne said into his shirt. It's really over. It's over, Ethan said. His voice wasn't steady. He didn't try to make it. He's done. He can't touch you. He can't touch either one of you, not ever again. Jacob squeezed happily between the 2 of them, grabbed a fistful of his mother's hair and a fistful of Ethan's collar, holding the both of them the way they were holding him. And Ethan. Caldwell looked down at the 2 people he'd sworn on his knees in the dark he would never let anyone take. And he made himself a second vow, right there in Victor Hale's ruined courtroom, one he had no words for yet and wouldn't find them for a while. But Marianne, looking up at his face, saw it made all the same, and she pressed closer, and she let herself, for the first time in 3 long years, stop being afraid. Around them the county was remaking itself in real time. Bell had his hat off and was wiping his eyes and pretending it was the heat. Tucker was standing on a bench, whooping all his young pride finally with something to do. And the townsfolk, the same townsfolk who'd charged her double for thread and pulled their children back from her on the boardwalk, were crowding forward now, wanting suddenly to have been on her side all along. An old woman pressing a wrapped loaf into her hands. A man who'd cut her dead in the street a week ago, now stammering that he'd always known Hale for what he was, always. Marianne took the loaf and thanked the old woman kindly, and let the rest of it wash past her, because she'd learned long ago what a town's approval was worth, and it wasn't worth turning her head from the only 2 faces that had stood by her when standing by her cost something. Ledbetter came over last, stooped and frayed, and grinning like a much younger man, and he put his crooked hand on Ethan's shoulder. Told you, the old lawyer said. Every liar leaves a seam. Took 3 years and a dying preacher, but by God we found his. His good eye was wet. Daniel Whitmore got his day. Late, but he got it. He looked at Marianne, and at the baby, and at the man holding them both. Take them home, Caldwell, all the way home. And don't you ever let me hear you call yourself a man with nothing to guard again. No, sir, Ethan said. I don't expect I'll have the trouble. And he took them home. All 3 of them in the wagon, through a county that would tell the story for 20 years back, up the long road to the ranch where a lamp would be lit in the window, and a garden would be growing, and a boy would sleep safe on a cushion. A good woman had stitched by hand back up the road to the place that had stopped somewhere in the last 2 months, without any of them quite noticing, when being a ranch a widow worked at and become the only thing it had ever really been underneath. A home. Theirs. Won, and paid for, and safe at last, and nobody left alive with the power to take it. The strange thing about winning, Ethan Caldwell learned in the days after, was how quiet it left everything. For 2 months, he'd lived braced for the coach, for Prentice, for Hale on the porch, for riders in the dark. He'd forgotten how to be a man who wasn't waiting for a blow. And now the blow had come and been turned aside, and Victor Hale was gone, and there was nothing left to brace against, and into that sudden quiet crept a thing Ethan hadn't reckoned on and didn't know what to do with. There was nothing left to fight for, which meant there was nothing left to hide behind. That first evening home from the courthouse, the ranch threw a kind of celebration nobody had planned. The hands came up from the bunkhouse, and Belle brought out a jug he'd been saving since before Ruth died, and Mary Ann cooked like the war was won, because it was. And for a few hours, the porch was loud with the particular happiness of people who have been afraid a long time and suddenly aren't. Tucker got a little drunk and made a speech nobody could follow about how he'd known the widow was good people from the very first morning, which was a lie, and everybody let him tell it anyway. Belle told stories about Ethan as a young fool that made Ethan wince, and Mary Ann laughed till she cried. And Jacob passed hand to hand around the porch like the most precious thing the ranch owned, which he was, fell asleep at last against Ethan's chest in the middle of all the noise, and stayed there. "He trusts you," Mary Ann said, sitting down beside them when the hands had drifted off to bed. "Sleeps right through a whole porch full of hollering long as he's on you. Smart boy. Knows where it's safe." Ethan looked down at the sleeping child, and his voice went quiet. "You know what I keep thinking? 2 months ago, I'd have called this the worst thing that could happen to a man. House full of noise, no peace, a baby drooling on my good shirt, 9 people wanting something from me every hour of the day." He shook his head slowly. "And now I can't figure how I stood the quiet as long as I did. It'd kill me now. The quiet would just kill me." Mary Ann didn't answer. She just rested her head on his shoulder on the other side from the baby, and the 3 of them sat there in the warm dark, and it should have been the happiest Ethan had ever been. And it nearly was. That was the trouble with what came next, that it came out of happiness, not sorrow, and a man never sees the blow that comes dressed as joy. The marshals came within the week, 3 of them. Federal men with cold eyes and thick notebooks, and they set up in the courthouse and started pulling Victor Hale's world apart, thread by thread, the way Ledbetter had promised they would. Ethan gave them the glove with the 2 initials stitched in the cuff, and Tucker gave them the faces of the men who'd jumped him, and the ferryman gave them his toll book, and one by one quiet folks who'd been too afraid to speak for 20 years started coming forward, because a man who's been shown he can be beaten stops being a man worth fearing. The dam broke. Word came that they'd matched the glove to Hale's own foreman. Word came that they were reopening the Osgood fire, that a hired man had turned and was talking to save his own neck, that the accident that killed a whole family 11 years back was looking more like arson every day. And word came on a hot morning near the end of it that Victor Hale had been formally charged not just with fraud, but with the murder of Daniel Whitmore on the strength of a dead man's letter, and a foreman who wanted to hang alone even less than most men do. Belle brought that news up from town and told it in the kitchen, and when he finished, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Mary Ann set down the bowl she was holding, and she walked out the kitchen door into the summer morning, and Ethan found her a few minutes later, standing at the fence with her back to the house and her shoulders shaking. "Mary Ann, I'm all right." She wasn't. "I'm all right. It's just—" She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. 3 years I've known what he did. 3 years I couldn't say it out loud without folks looking at me like a bitter woman making excuses. And now a court's going to say it. In front of everybody. Daniel didn't drink. Daniel didn't fall. Daniel was murdered, and they're going to say his name and call it what it was. She turned, and her face was wet and fierce all at once. "He gets his name back, Ethan. Do you understand what that means? Jacob's going to grow up knowing his father was a good man who was killed for being honest. Not a drunk who fell in a river. A good man." Her voice broke clean through. "That's all I ever wanted. More than the land, more than any of it. I just wanted my son to know who his father really was." Ethan didn't say anything. He just opened his arms and she came into them, and he held her while she cried out 3 years of it against his chest and over the top of her head. He looked out at the summer country and felt something in himself that he couldn't name, something that was glad for her, and grieving for the dead man he'd never met, and underneath both cold and low and creeping a thing that felt almost like fear, because holding her like this felt like the most natural thing in the world. And that was exactly the problem. He put her from him gently, after a while, and something had changed in his face, and Marianne, who read him better than he read himself, felt it before she understood it. "You've gone somewhere," she said. "Where'd you go?" "Nowhere. I'm right here." "You're not." She studied him. "You've been half gone for 3 days, ever since the marshals came. Talk to me." But Ethan couldn't. That was the thing of it. He'd found the words for everything else that summer, found the courage to fight and to feel and to hold a child and stand in a courtroom. But this last thing, this one, he couldn't get his mouth around. So he did what a lifetime of hard men had taught him to do, with a feeling too big to face. He backed away from it. "I've got fences to mend," he said. "The north line's still down from where they cut it." And he took his hat, and he went, and Marianne stood at the kitchen fence watching him go, and felt the first cold draft of a door she'd thought was open, starting quietly to swing shut. The days that followed were the loneliest she'd spent on that ranch, and the cruelty of it was that nothing was wrong. Nothing had happened. Ethan was unfailingly kind. He was up before dawn and worked till dark and asked after Jacob and thanked her for every meal and never once said a hard word. And he did not touch her, and he did not sit up with her at night, and he did not meet her eyes across the table, the way he'd started to, and the warmth that had been growing between them for 2 months just cooled. Careful, polite, distant. He was doing the thing he'd done for 3 years before she came. He was building the wall back brick by brick from the inside, and she was on the outside of it now, and she didn't understand why. She understood one thing, though, with a clarity that frightened her. She couldn't stay like this. She'd spent 3 years learning to need no one. She'd broken that rule for this man, let herself lean, let herself hope, and now here she was standing at a cooling hearth, watching him wall himself away. And it was worse. It was so much worse than never having leaned at all. A woman couldn't live in a house with a man who'd taught her to need him and then decided he'd rather not be needed. That wasn't a home. That was just a slower kind of alone. So on the 6th night, she made a decision, and she brought it to him at the fence, where he was pretending to fix a rail that didn't need fixing. "I'm going to take a place in town," she said. Ethan went still. "What?" "The widow Garrett's got a room she'll let me in. The general store needs a seamstress now that folks know my work, and there's talk the schoolhouse could use a woman to cook the noon meal for the children." She kept her voice steady the way she'd learned. "The debt's gone. I'm free and clear thanks to you. I can make my own way now, and I should. It's not right me living out here indefinitely a widow in a man's house with the whole county talking. You've done more than any soul on earth had a right to expect. But it's time Jacob and I stood on our own feet. You." Ethan set down the hammer. His voice wasn't steady either, and he didn't seem to notice. "You want to leave?" "I don't want anything, Ethan. I'm telling you what's sensible." And then, because she was tired and hurt, and because a woman can only hold her chin up so long before it starts to shake, the truth came out sideways. "I can't stay here and watch you go back to being a stranger. That's the honest reason. I lived through my husband dying. I don't think I could live through you deciding you'd rather not have let me in a little more each day for the rest of my life. So I'll go, while it still only hurts this much. That's not—" Ethan's hands opened and closed. "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" "Because for 3 days, you've looked at me like I'm something you're sorry you picked up." And there it was. The wall had a crack in it, and she'd put her hand right through. Ethan turned away from her, gripped the top rail of the fence, and for a long moment she thought he'd just let her go. Let her pack the trunk again, put her and the boy in the wagon, drive them to town and a rented room, and a life that was safe and small and alone. It would have been the easiest thing. He'd spent 3 years being a man who let the easiest thing happen. But he'd spent 2 months learning to be another kind of man, and that man, when it came down to it, could not let her walk. "Ruth," he said. Marianne waited. "I keep her out past the barn, under the cottonwood. Her and the baby both in the one grave." His knuckles were white on the rail. 3 years I've gone out there every Sunday, and stood over that grave and told her I was sorry. Sorry I couldn't save her. Sorry I lived and she didn't. Sorry the doctor was 40 miles too far. Every Sunday, 3 years. His voice had gone rough and low. And this last Sunday, I went out there and I stood over that grave same as always, and I opened my mouth to say I was sorry and I couldn't. Because I wasn't. Not the way I had been. Because for the first time in 3 years, I woke up in the morning and I wasn't sorry to be alive. He turned around and his face was wrecked. You did that. You and the boy. You made me glad to be living again. And I stood over my dead wife's grave and I felt glad to be alive. And Marianne. God help me. It felt like I was killing her all over again. Marianne's anger went out of her all at once. Oh, Ethan. So I backed off. From you, from the boy, from the feeling. Because as long as I don't let myself have it, I'm not betraying her by wanting it. The words were coming faster now, 3 days of dammed up misery breaking loose. I sat up thinking on it every night this week. Told myself the decent thing, the loyal thing was to keep you at arm's length. Let you go to town. Let you build your life. Be your good landlord and your friend, and nothing more, and stay faithful to a woman 3 years in the ground. That's what a good man does. Ain't it? He shook his head lost. I don't know how to be alive and glad and still be loyal to her. I don't know how to do both. So I was fixing to do neither. I was fixing to let you leave and go back to guarding a grave because at least a grave never asks me to be happy. The summer evening had gone very quiet around them. Marianne stepped closer. She took the hammer out of his hand and set it on the fence post, and she took both his hard, scarred hands in her small ones, and she made him look at her. Tell me about her, she said. About Ruth. Marianne. No, tell me. You've carried her alone for 3 years. You've made her into a stone you visit and a debt you can't pay. That's not a wife. That's a wound. Her thumbs moved over his knuckles. Who was she? What did she laugh at? What did she cook badly? Tell me the real woman, not the grave. And Ethan, who had not spoken Ruth's name aloud to a living soul in 3 years, found himself telling her. Haltingly at first, then not haltingly at all. He told her Ruth couldn't cook a biscuit to save her life and knew it, and laughed about it. He told her Ruth used to sing off-key while she worked and didn't care who heard. He told her Ruth had wanted 6 children and had teased him that she'd fill the whole ranch up with noise. He told her Ruth had been kind to every stray thing that ever wandered onto the place, dogs and drifters, and once, a whole family of orphaned kittens she'd raised on a rag dipped in milk. He talked until the words ran out, and by the end he was half laughing and half weeping, and Marianne was doing both right along with him, and something that had been clenched shut in him for 3 years came slowly open. She sounds, Marianne said gently, like a woman who would be furious with you. Ethan blinked. Furious? A woman who wanted 6 children and a ranch full of noise. A woman who raised orphaned kittens on a milk rag because she couldn't stand a living thing going without love. Marianne's eyes were wet and steady. You think a woman like that is up there wanting you to spend the rest of your life alone, guarding an empty house, turning away a widow and a baby who need exactly the home she built. You think that's what she wants? She shook her head. Ethan, that woman didn't leave you a grave to guard. She left you a house full of room for love, and it about killed her to leave it empty. Being glad to be alive isn't betraying her. It's the only thing you could ever do that would make her rest easy. She doesn't want your grief. No woman who ever loved a man wants his grief. She wants his life. She wants it lived. Ethan Caldwell stood at the fence in the last of the summer light, and wept, really wept, for the first time since the day he'd buried them, and Marianne held him through it, the way he'd held her through the fever and the courtroom, and every hard hour of that long summer. And when it was done, he felt lighter than he had in 3 years, hollowed out and washed clean, like a man who'd finally set down a weight he'd forgotten wasn't part of his own body. I don't want you to go to town, he said when he could talk. I know. I mean it. I don't want a good landlord and a friend. I've been alone 3 years, and it near ate me alive, and then you came, and I don't... He stopped, gathered it said the truest thing he knew. I hired a cook. That's what I told myself. I put out a notice for a cook because the house was too quiet, and I was too proud to say I was starving for something a cook couldn't fix. The truth is, I didn't need a cook, Marianne. I was just too broke inside to ask for what I really needed, which was healing and a reason, and you. I didn't hire a cook. I was too broken to ask to be saved. Marianne's breath caught. Then we were both lost, she said softly, until we stopped running. I ran 400 miles to keep from needing anybody, and you built a wall 3 years high, and we were both just hiding from the same thing. From being loved again, from risking it again. She pressed her forehead to his. I stopped running the day I refused to get back in that coach. I just didn't know that's what I was doing. Marry me. It came out of him plain and rough, and without a scrap of the flowery nonsense a woman might expect, and it landed in the summer quiet between them and sat there enormous. Ethan Caldwell. She pulled back to look at him. Are you asking me because you love me, or because you're afraid of the wall going back up? Both, he said honestly. I won't lie to you. Some of it's fear, but most of it. He took her face in his rough hands. Most of it's that I have not had one full night's easy sleep in 3 years, except the nights I've known you were under this roof. Most of it's that the sound of that boy laughing in my yard is the best sound I ever heard in my life, better than any silence I ever guarded. Most of it's that I love you so bad, I made myself miserable trying not to for a week, and I'm done trying. So yes, both. But mostly the love. Marry me. Stay. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to run from anything again. Marianne Whitmore, who had crossed a territory with a baby and $4 and a determination to need. No one looked at the man who'd carried her trunk when he meant to send her off, and she stopped at last, and for good running. Yes, she said. Yes, you stubborn, broken, wonderful man, yes. He kissed her then at the fence in the summer dark, and somewhere behind them in the house, a baby who ought to have been asleep started fussing, and they broke apart laughing and went in together to see to their son. Their son. Neither of them said it out loud that night. But both of them thought it, and both of them knew the other thought it, and it was true. They were married 3 weeks later on the ranch under the cottonwood tree. Marianne had chosen the spot herself, and when she told Ethan where she wanted to stand to say the vows, he'd gone quiet because it was 10 steps from Ruth's grave. I want her there, Marianne had said simply. She built this, all of it. The house, the love in it, the room for us. I'm not going to stand somewhere she can't see like I'm ashamed. I want to say my vows where she can hear, and I want to thank her in my heart for leaving the door open. And Ethan had had to walk out to the barn and stand in the dark a while before he could answer, and when he came back, all he said was, "She'd have liked you. She'd have liked you more than she liked me, probably." And that was the whole of it. Half the county came. The same county that had charged Marianne double for thread and pulled their children back on the boardwalk, they came now with covered dishes and shy apologies and a barn-raising's worth of goodwill, because a county that watches a widow bring down its worst man discovers all at once that it admired her all along. Marianne received them all with grace and forgave them nothing and everything, both at once the way strong women do. And if a few of the church wives got a colder nod than the rest, well, they'd earned it, and they knew it, and they took it. Ledbetter gave the bride away, stooped and frayed and prouder than any father. Belle stood up for Ethan and cried the whole time and blamed it again on the heat. And Tucker had appointed himself keeper of the ring and guardian of Jacob both, and he carried the boy on his shoulders through the whole ceremony. And when the preacher asked who witnessed this union, Tucker hollered, "We all do," before anyone could stop him, and the whole crowd laughed and then cheered, and that was that. There was one bad moment. There's always one. It came near the end of the vows, when the circuit preacher, a young one new to the county who'd taken over old Kobe's route, asked if any soul present knew a reason these two should not be joined. It was only a formality. Nobody expected an answer. But a rider had come up the ranch road during the ceremony, a stranger, and he swung down at the edge of the crowd, and for one terrible heartbeat, the whole gathering went cold, thinking of clean coats and leather books, and men who came up that road to take things away. But it wasn't one of Hale's. It was one of the marshals, dusty from the road hat in his hand, and he'd come not to disturb the wedding, but because he'd wanted Mary Ann to know before the sun set on her wedding day. "Beg pardon, ma'am. Didn't mean to interrupt." He turned his hat in his hands. "Only I figured you'd want to hear it from a man's mouth and not off a paper. The grand jury handed down this morning. Victor Hale's bound over for trial. Murder in the first degree for your husband. Arson and murder for the Osgood family. Fraud near a dozen counts for the rest." His weathered face was grave and satisfied both. "He'll never draw another free breath, ma'am. I'd stake my badge on it. I thought you ought to know it today. Seemed fitting somehow." He put his hat back on, nodded once. "Congratulations to you both. I'll see myself off. Sorry again for the interruption." And he mounted up and rode back down the road, and the cold that had gripped the crowd turned in an instant to something else entirely. Mary Ann stood under the cottonwood in her wedding dress, and heard that the man who'd murdered her first husband would answer for it on the very day she married her second. And she turned to Ethan with tears streaming down her face, and she laughed, and she cried. And the preacher, sensing the moment had gotten away from him entirely, simply raised his voice over the whole joyful mess and pronounced them man and wife, and the county roared. The celebration that followed lasted till near midnight. Somebody had brought a fiddle, and somebody else a guitar, and the yard that had known nothing but grief and gunfire filled up with dancing and firelight and the smell of a whole steer roasting. Ledbetter got up on a wagon bed to give a toast, and his voice, thin with age and drink, carried out over the crowd. "I've practiced law 40 years, the old man said, "and I have learned exactly one thing worth passing on. The law is slow, and the law is often a coward, and the law will let a wicked man prosper for 20 years while good folks suffer." He raised his cup. "But every now and again, if enough decent people refuse to run, and refuse to sell, and refuse to look away every now and again, the slow old law catches up to a wicked man at last, and there is no finer sight on this earth. To Daniel Whitmore, who wouldn't sell, to the widow who wouldn't run, and to Ethan Caldwell, who finally, thank God, stopped guarding an empty house and started guarding what mattered. Long life to the both of them, and may their ranch never know a quiet night again." The county drank to that loud and long, and Ethan pulled Mary Ann in against him and kissed her in front of all of them, and Belle wept openly and didn't bother blaming the heat this time, and Tucker, still carrying Jacob on his shoulders, spun the boy in a circle till they both fell down laughing in the grass. They finished the vows 10 steps from Ruth's grave, and if a warm wind moved through the cottonwood leaves just then, stirring them so they whispered, well, Ethan noticed it, and Mary Ann noticed it, and neither of them said a word, but Ethan's hand tightened on his new wife's, and he looked toward the grave, and he thought very clearly, "Thank you," and let it go. The summer wore on, golden after that, and the ranch that had been a place of silence and grief became, without anyone quite marking the day it changed, the loudest and happiest place in the county. Jacob learned to walk that summer. He took his first steps across the kitchen floor from Belle's hands to Ethan's, and Ethan caught him and swung him up over his head, and the boy shrieked with laughter. And Ethan Caldwell, who 3 months before had eaten cold biscuits alone in a dead house, stood in his loud, warm kitchen holding a laughing child over his head, and understood that he had gotten back somehow everything he'd buried under the cottonwood. Not the same, never the same, but real and living and his. And then a few weeks after the wedding, the boy said the word. It came at supper plain as anything, Jacob banging his spoon and looking straight at Ethan across the table, and what came out of him was, Pa. Just that. Pa. Not a question, not a reach of fact, the way a child states a fact, like the sky is up and the dog is brown, and this man is Pa. The whole table went quiet. Mary Ann's hand flew to her mouth. And Ethan Caldwell, hard man, grieving man, the man who'd sworn 3 years running he'd never have anything to lose again, set down his fork with a hand that was not steady, and got up and came around the table and lifted the boy out of his chair and held him, and could not for the life of him say a single word. He's been working up to it a week. Mary Ann said softly, her own eyes streaming, I didn't want to spoil it by telling you. He called me Pa. Ethan said to nobody, to the room to the ceiling. "Did you hear him?" "He called me Pa." "I heard him. The whole county probably heard him." She came and put her arms around the both of them. "You are his Pa, Ethan. The only one he'll ever remember. Blood's got nothing to do with it. You're the man who caught him when he took his first step, and the man who'll teach him to ride, and the man who'll walk him out to that cottonwood one day and tell him about the good father he can't remember who died keeping a spring for him. That's a Pa. That's the whole of what a Pa is." She kissed the side of his head. "Welcome to it." And there was the matter of the water, because when the marshals broke up Victor Hale's holdings, the vast range, the stolen homesteads, the water he'd murdered and forged and burned his way into owning for 20 years, the court had to decide what to do with all of it. And Ledbetter, who had one more fight left in him, argued before the territorial court that the stolen homesteads ought to go back to the families Hale had run off, and where those families were dead or scattered, that the water ought to be held in common for all the small ranchers of the county, so that no one man could ever again choke a country dry to bend it to his will. He won that fight too, the Whitmore homestead. Daniel's 160 acres, the good spring he'd died refusing to sell, came back to Mary Ann free and clear, in Jacob's name, held in trust for the boy until he came of age. "It's his," Mary Ann said, standing on the porch, reading the deed with shaking hands. "His father's land. His father died for it, and now it's his, and no one can ever take it. Oh, Ethan." She pressed the paper to her chest. "Daniel didn't die for nothing. He died keeping that spring out of Hale's hands, and now it's kept out forever, and his son will grow up on it. He won. In the end, Daniel won. It just took 3 years and everything to see it." And Ethan, standing beside her, said the thing he'd been thinking for weeks. "We'll work it together. His land and mine run as one till he's grown. And when he's a man, he'll have a choice I never gave a thought to at his age, a whole ranch of his own, free and clear, and a spring his father gave his life for. That's a good thing to be able to give a boy." He put his arm around her. "That's leaving something good behind, just like his daddy wanted." Mary Ann leaned into him and didn't answer because she couldn't and didn't need to. It was near the end of that summer, on an evening when the whole ranch had gathered on the porch after supper. Ethan and Mary Ann and Jacob Bell with his pipe. Tucker still finding excuses to hang around the house long after his work was done, that Mary Ann told Ethan the last thing, the thing she'd been holding a few weeks now, waiting for the right quiet moment. She leaned over and said it low, just for him. "The house is going to get louder still come spring." Ethan didn't understand for a second. Then he did. And the look that came over his face, the raw, disbelieving, cracked open joy of it, was a thing Mary Ann would carry the rest of her life. "Ruth wanted 6, he said, when he could talk at all, and his voice broke on it, and it wasn't grief that broke it. "She always said she wanted to fill the whole ranch up with noise." "Then we'd best get started," Mary Ann said, on filling it up for her. The baby came the next spring, a girl red-faced and furious and healthy, with her mother's stubborn chin and a voice that could carry clear to the north pasture, and they named her Ruth, and if that choice surprised the county, it did not surprise anyone who understood what had happened on that ranch. Mary Ann had insisted on it. "There's room in a family for more than one woman to be loved," she'd said, "and I won't have my daughter grow up thinking the first Ruth was a shadow we tiptoed around. She was the woman who built this home. Our girl will carry her name proud." And Ethan had held his newborn daughter and looked toward the cottonwood and been unable to speak at all. By the summer after that, the ranch was the fullest and loudest place in 3 counties. Jacob was near 3 by then and ran the yard like he owned it, which in a manner of speaking he did, trailed everywhere by a patient old dog Tucker had brought him, and by Bell, who had appointed himself the boy's shadow and chief spoiler. Little Ruth had learned to crawl and was a menace on the kitchen floor. The hands had come back. Word had gotten around that the Caldwell outfit was the best fed and happiest spread in the territory, and good men wanted to work there, and Ethan had his pick of them now. The 2 ranches ran as one. Caldwell Water and Whitmore Spring, the finest and best watered range in the county, and every small rancher for 40 miles drew freely from the common water the court had freed from Hale's dead hand, so that the whole country was greener and kinder than it had been in 20 years. And Victor Hale hanged that spring in the territorial capital, convicted on every count, the fraud the Osgood family and Daniel Whitmore murdered, for a spring he wouldn't sell. Mary Ann did not go to watch. "I've given that man enough of my life," she said. "He doesn't get my daughter's first spring, too." She learned it was done from a one-line letter Ledbetter sent, read it once at the kitchen table, folded it, and went back to feeding her children. And that was the last thought she ever spent on Victor Hale. And it was exactly the right amount. It was on an evening late in that second summer. The whole ranch gathered on the porch after supper, the way they always were, now that Ethan Caldwell pulled his wife and his children in against him, and looked out at the good land and the good water and the good people on it. And he thought about all of it. About the letter he'd torn in half the day. A stagecoach came tearing up his road, about the boy who'd reached for him in the fever dark, about the woman who'd refused to climb back in that coach, about a dead man's letter, and a dying preacher, and a spring worth dying for, about Ruth under the cottonwood, and the daughter who now carried her name. And he understood finally and completely the one thing it had taken him 3 years and a whole hard summer to learn. A man does not heal by saving other people. He heals by being brave enough at last to let himself be saved. Ethan Caldwell had spent 3 years believing he'd taken in a widow and her child out of the last mercy left in a broken heart. The truth he knew now was the other way around entirely, and had been from the first. They were the ones who had come up that road and saved him. And a family, he had learned, was not the thing you were born into, or the thing that was taken from you in a single terrible summer. A family was the thing you built on purpose, out of grief and strangers and second chances, and the plain daily courage of loving people who could be lost. And once a man had built one, once he had truly built it, there was not a debt, or a lie, or a dead man's grave, or all the silence in the world that could ever take it from him again. He had come home, all the way home, and he was never going to be alone again,